Picture yourself stranded in a vast, searing desert. The sun is relentless, a blazing eye in a sky bleached white by heat. There's no water in sight, only endless waves of sand that shimmer with a deceptive beauty. Every breath feels like a furnace blast, and the horizon offers no hope, no refuge. It's one of the most hostile environments on Earth, a place where survival seems like a desperate gamble against impossible odds. Now, rewind the clock thousands of years. Against this very same brutal backdrop, an entire civilization not only survived but thrived, building one of the most magnificent and enduring empires in human history. How did they do it? The answer is far more fascinating than you might think. The ancient Egyptians were masters of their environment, and their secret weapon was a suite of ingenious technologies specifically designed for desert survival technologies that weren't just practical, but were downright cool. This wasn't about mere endurance, it was about brilliant adaptation and a profound understanding of the world around them. While many of us imagine the Egyptians solely through the lens of pyramids and pharaohs, their day-to-day innovations for living in an arid climate reveal a level of creativity and scientific thinking that feels almost modern. They transformed the challenges of the desert into opportunities, developing solutions for water, shelter, and travel that were both effective and elegantly simple. These weren't crude, primitive tools. They were the results of careful observation, experimentation, and a deep, accumulated wisdom passed down through generations. Their survival tech was a form of quiet genius, woven into the very fabric of their culture and enabling them to achieve the impossible in a land that offered very little. So, how exactly did they pull it off? What were these incredible inventions that allowed them to flourish where so many would perish? In this journey, we're going to uncover the secrets of ancient Egyptian cool tech for desert survival. We will explore the brilliant methods they used to find and preserve water, the architectural secrets that kept their homes and buildings refreshingly cool, and the clever adaptations that made travel across the sands not just possible, but efficient. This is a story of human ingenuity at its finest, a testament to a people who looked at one of the planet's harshest landscapes and saw not a barrier, but a home. Get ready to be amazed by the practical, the clever, and the truly cool ways the ancient Egyptians conquered the desert. At the heart of this incredible story of adaptation lies a single life-giving ribbon of water, the Nile River. To truly understand ancient Egyptian survival, you need to grasp that the Nile wasn't just a feature of their landscape. It was the very engine of their civilization, the ultimate piece of natural technology that they learned to harness with breathtaking skill. Imagine that river not as a static blue line on a map, but as a living, breathing entity with a powerful, predictable pulse. Every year, without fail, the summer rains would fall far to the south in the highlands of Ethiopia, causing the Nile to swell and burst its bank. This was the annual inundation, a 3-month-long event the Egyptians called the Akhet. As the floodwaters receded, they left behind a thick, nutrient-rich layer of black silt, a gift of fertility that transformed the desert's edge into a lush, arable paradise. This narrow strip of land became known as the Kemet, the Black Land, a stark and life-sustaining contrast to the desert, the red land of the surrounding desert. This predictable, cyclical gift of water and soil is what made everything else possible. It was the foundation upon which every pyramid was built and every pharaoh's power was established. But the Egyptians were far from passive recipients of this annual bounty. They became masters of hydrological engineering, developing a sophisticated system to extend the river's reach far beyond its natural banks. They constructed vast networks of earthen canals and basins to channel and trap the precious floodwaters. Once the water was captured in these immense, shallow pools, they would allow the silt to settle, effectively creating temporary, localized reservoirs. Then, through a system of sluices and gates, they would strategically drain the water back into the Nile or into secondary canals, now having extended the period of moisture availability for their crops. This wasn't just simple irrigation, it was a form of large-scale, seasonal water management that required incredible foresight and communal cooperation. Entire villages had to work in concert to build and maintain these systems, a collective effort that literally shaped their society and calendar. Their entire year was divided into 3 seasons based on the river's behavior: Akit, the inundation; Parat, the growing season when the fields emerged from the water; and Shemu, the harvest season of drought. Their lives, their economy, and their very conception of time were dictated by the rhythm of their ultimate lifeline. This profound relationship with the Nile allowed them to achieve agricultural productivity that was the envy of the ancient world. In the rich, constantly rejuvenated soil of the Black Land, they cultivated massive quantities of emmer wheat and barley, the staples of their diet that allowed them to feed a vast and growing population. They grew flax for linen, the primary textile that provided lightweight, breathable clothing perfect for the desert heat. They cultivated papyrus in the marshy fringes, a versatile reed used for everything from making paper and ropes to constructing boats. This agricultural surplus was the critical fuel for their civilization. It freed a significant portion of the population from the daily grind of food production, allowing them to become artisans, scribes, soldiers, and the immense labor force that built the monumental structures we marvel at today. Without the predictable, life-giving power of the Nile, meticulously managed by human ingenuity, there would have been no surplus energy, no specialized workforce, and ultimately, no pyramids, no temples, and no golden age of the pharaohs. The river was the irreplaceable first piece of technology, the one that turned survival into a thriving, vibrant culture capable of enduring for millennia. Yet, for all its power, the annual flood had a limitation. It naturally watered the land immediately adjacent to the river, but those fertile basins only stretched so far. What about the fields that lay just a little higher, just beyond the reach of the receding waters? This was the next great challenge for Egyptian farmers, and their solution was a device of such elegant simplicity that it became a cornerstone of their agriculture for thousands of years: the shaduf. Imagine a long, horizontal pole like a seesaw, balanced on an upright wooden frame. From one end of this pole hangs a bucket, often made of leather or woven reeds. On the other end is a heavy counterweight, typically a lump of dried mud or a stone. This is the shaduf, and its operation was a beautiful application of basic physics. A farmer would pull down on the bucket end, dipping it into the Nile or a canal. After filling the bucket with water, the counterweight would naturally do its job, making it remarkably easy to lift the heavy bucket back up. The farmer would then simply swing the pole around and empty the water into an irrigation ditch that fed the higher level fields. With a rhythmic, rocking motion, one person could lift and move vast quantities of water every day. This seemingly simple tool was nothing short of revolutionary. Before the shaduf, watering fields that weren't flooded required back-breaking labor, hauling water up in jars by hand, a slow and exhausting process that severely limited how much land could be effectively cultivated. The shaduf changed the entire equation. By leveraging the power of the counterweight, it reduced the physical effort needed to lift water by as much as 80%. This meant a single farmer could irrigate a much larger plot of land, and do so more efficiently and with less fatigue. The impact of this cannot be overstated. It allowed Egyptian agriculture to literally climb to new heights, systematically reclaiming the desert fringe and turning previously marginal land into productive fields for grains, vegetables, and fruit orchards. Villages could now expand their territories, establishing farms further and further from the immediate riverbank. This expansion was crucial for feeding a growing population and supporting the large, non-farming workforce in the cities and at the massive construction sites of the pyramids and temples. The true brilliance of the shaduf, however, lay in its scalability and accessibility. It wasn't a complex piece of technology that required rare materials or specialized craftsmen to build. It was made from wood, rope, and a heavy object materials readily available to any farming community. This meant that even the smallest, most remote farm could adopt and benefit from its use. Furthermore, the Egyptians often deployed shadufs in series, creating a kind of hydraulic ladder. One shaduf would lift water from the river into a primary ditch. A second one further up the bank would lift it again to a higher channel, and so on, until water could be delivered to terrace fields high above the Nile Valley. This cascading system allowed them to push the boundaries of their agricultural empire ever further into the arid landscape. The rhythmic, creaking sound of the shaduf became the soundtrack to Egyptian rural life, a persistent pulse of human ingenuity that turned the desert's edge green. It was a perfect example of their practical genius taking a fundamental principle of mechanics and applying it on a mass scale to solve one of their most persistent survival challenges, ensuring that the life-giving gift of the Nile could reach every corner of their civilization. But the ingenuity of Egyptian water management didn't stop at the riverbank. For a civilization whose influence stretched hundreds of miles through unforgiving desert, the ability to take water with them was just as critical as the ability to lift it. Their survival while traveling for trade, military campaigns, or mining expeditions hinged on developing portable hydration systems that were remarkably effective. The most common solution was also one of the most versatile: pottery. This wasn't just any pottery. Egyptian artisans engineered water jars with a deep understanding of their environment. They crafted vessels with thick, porous walls from a specific type of clay. This might seem counterintuitive, but the porosity was a deliberate feature. As water slowly seeped through the microscopic pores to the jar's outer surface, it would evaporate in the dry desert air. This process of evaporative cooling, a fundamental principle of physics, actually drew heat from the water stored inside, chilling it significantly. A well-designed water jar could keep its contents up to 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than the surrounding air, providing a refreshingly cool drink in the blistering heat. The designs were also meticulously thought out. Many water jars featured narrow necks and were often sealed with a stopper made of cloth-covered mud or a fitted pottery lid. This dual-purpose design was brilliant. The narrow opening minimized the surface area of the water exposed to the air, dramatically reducing direct evaporation. Simultaneously, it made the vessel easier to carry, often balanced on the head or secured with rope nets for transport on donkeys. Some pots were even partially buried in the sand at a campsite, using the cooler temperatures just below the surface to augment their natural cooling effect. For longer journeys, the Egyptians employed larger, more robust storage vessels called amphorae. These were often coated with a resin on the inside to make them fully watertight, preventing any loss of precious liquid over weeks or months of storage. The humble water pot was, in essence, a passive, zero-energy refrigerator, a testament to their ability to manipulate material science to serve a vital survival need. For situations demanding even greater durability and lighter weight, the Egyptians turned to another resource readily available to them: animal skins. They would take the intact skins of goats or sheep, cure them, and seal the openings to create flexible, sturdy water containers known as water skins. The process of making one was an art in itself. After carefully skinning the animal to preserve the hide's integrity, they would cure it using techniques like smoking or treating it with tannins from acacia bark, which prevented rot and made the leather supple and strong. The openings at the legs and neck would be tightly sewn or tied shut, leaving one opening that could be sealed with a wooden plug or a leather thong. The resulting container was incredibly tough, capable of being knocked about on a bumpy chariot ride or a long desert trek without shattering like a pottery jar would. The water skin's flexibility was its superpower. As water was consumed, the skin would simply collapse, eliminating the empty air space that would slosh around in a rigid pot. This airless environment was crucial because it prevented the growth of algae and bacteria, keeping the water fresher for longer periods. For soldiers on the march or traders leading camel caravans, this lightweight, durable, and self-regulating container was the ultimate canteen. They could be easily slung over a shoulder or across a saddle, conforming to the body or the pack for easy transport. On a grander scale, large water skins were indispensable for supplying the massive state-sponsored expeditions sent to remote regions like the quarries of the Eastern Desert or the turquoise mines of the Sinai. Without these portable hydration systems, the vast trade networks that brought gold, incense, and lapis lazuli to the Nile Valley, and the military campaigns that secured Egypt's borders would have been impossible. Each water skin and cooled pottery jar represented a mobile oasis, a life-sustaining bubble of the Nile's bounty that allowed Egyptian influence to flow effortlessly across the sands. Now, think about what happens when you step out of that scorching desert sun and into the shade, the immediate, almost shocking drop in temperature. The ancient Egyptians understood this principle on an architectural scale. While their mastery of water was about sustaining life, their mastery of shelter was about creating a comfortable, livable world right in the heart of that heat. They didn't just build houses, they engineered entire structures to function as passive cooling systems, turning the harsh desert climate into a manageable, even pleasant environment. Their architectural philosophy wasn't about fighting the sun head-on, but about working with the environment, using clever design and locally sourced materials to create sanctuaries of coolness. The foundation of this architectural genius was a material that seems almost too humble to be revolutionary: mud. The Egyptians built their homes primarily from mud brick, a substance that was not only freely available but perfectly suited to the task. The process of making these bricks was a community affair. Workers would mix Nile mud with sand, straw, and water. The straw acted as a binding agent, preventing the bricks from cracking as they dried, while the sand reduced shrinkage. This mixture was then packed into wooden molds and left to bake solid under the relentless sun. The result was a brick that was durable, inexpensive, and most importantly, possessed incredible thermal mass. Thick walls built from these mud bricks became the cornerstone of Egyptian climate control. During the blisteringly hot day, these dense walls would slowly absorb heat from the air, preventing it from penetrating into the living spaces. Then, as the temperature plummeted during the cool desert night, the walls would gradually release that stored heat back into the interior, effectively warming the home. This natural regulation created a much more stable and comfortable indoor temperature, a stark contrast to the dramatic swings outside. The design of the buildings themselves was a masterclass in minimizing heat gain. If you look at reconstructions of a typical Egyptian home, one of the first things you'll notice is the scarcity of windows. They weren't trying to capture a view, they were building a fortress against the sun. The windows they did include were small, narrow, and positioned high up on the walls. This strategic placement served two critical purposes. First, it drastically limited the amount of direct sunlight that could enter and heat up the rooms. Second, because hot air rises, these high windows allowed the warmest air inside the home to escape, creating a subtle but effective ventilation current. The entrance to a house was often a simple, offset opening rather than a large door, further reducing the surface area exposed to the sun's rays. The floors were typically made of compacted earth, which, like the walls, had high thermal mass, staying cool underfoot even on the hottest days. Roofs were flat, constructed from wooden beams topped with mats and more layers of mud, providing another thick layer of insulation against the solar radiation beating down from above. Beyond the individual house, the Egyptians extended their climate-conscious design to the entire layout of their homes and estates, with the courtyard being the central organizing feature. And like the enclosed, private courtyards of some other cultures, the Egyptian version was often a multifunctional outdoor room, meticulously designed to manipulate airflow. Usually located on the north side of the property to catch the prevailing cool breezes from the Mediterranean, the courtyard acted as a natural air scoop. It would capture these winds and funnel them into the surrounding rooms through strategically placed doorways and those high windows. Many families would place a small, shallow pool of water in the center of the courtyard. As air moved across the surface of this water, it would undergo evaporative cooling, dropping in temperature before flowing further into the home. This created a natural, zero-energy air conditioning system. The courtyard was also a source of shade and a place for daily life to unfold, a cool, protected outdoor space for cooking, crafting, and socializing during the cooler parts of the day. This architectural wisdom wasn't reserved solely for permanent dwellings. For travelers, soldiers, and miners venturing into the deep desert, the principles remained the same, just adapted for temporary use. They would construct simple, quick shelters using whatever materials were at hand: stones piled into low walls, animal skins stretched over frames, or even digging shallow depressions in the sand. The goal was always to create a barrier against the sun and wind. Even a simple lean-to, oriented correctly to provide maximum shade during the peak heat, could make the difference between life and death. This profound understanding of their environment, from the grandest villa to the most rudimentary campsite, reveals a culture that was deeply attuned to the rhythms and realities of their world. They didn't see the desert as an enemy to be conquered with brute force, but as a set of conditions to be intelligently managed, turning their homes into customizable ecosystems of comfort through the brilliant, passive technology of thoughtful design. So far, we've explored how the ancient Egyptians engineered their environment for survival, from the water-lifting shaduf to the climate-smart design of their homes. But what about the one piece of technology they wore every single day? We're talking about their clothing, and specifically, the most common garment for men and women alike, the calasiris. This simple linen dress or tunic was far more than just a fashion statement. It was a masterclass in desert survival physiology, a wearable piece of cool tech designed to protect the body from the brutal sun and searing wind. The fundamental principle behind its design was one we still follow in hot climates today: coverage. In a modern context, those living in desert regions, like the Bedouin, wear long, flowing robes that cover them from head to toe. The ancient Egyptians followed the exact same logic. The calasiris was typically a long garment, falling anywhere from the knee to the ankle, with straps or sleeves covering the shoulders. This full body coverage provided a crucial physical barrier against two of the desert's most immediate threats: intense solar radiation and the constant, abrasive onslaught of wind-blown sand. The choice of material was just as scientifically brilliant as the garment's cut. The Egyptians almost exclusively used linen woven from the fibers of the flax plant. Linen possesses several inherent properties that make it the perfect textile for a hot, dry climate. First, it is an incredibly breathable fabric. The Egyptians often wove their linen with a loose, open weave. This created thousands of tiny gaps in the fabric that acted as ventilation channels. As the wearer moved, air would flow easily through these microscopic openings, carrying away sweat and body heat before they could build up. This process of convective cooling kept the skin surface much drier and more comfortable than if it were covered by a densely woven, non-porous fabric. Furthermore, linen is highly absorbent. It can soak up a significant amount of moisture like perspiration without feeling unpleasantly wet or sticky against the skin. It then releases that moisture into the dry air through evaporation very quickly, which has an additional cooling effect. This combination of breathability and wicking capability made linen a far superior choice to alternatives like wool or heavy leather, which would have been stifling in the Egyptian heat. Beyond the fabric's weave, its color served a vital, functional purpose. Archaeological evidence and tomb paintings show that the linen worn for everyday work was almost always a natural, off-white or beige color. This was not an aesthetic accident. It was a deliberate application of basic physics. Light colors, especially white, are highly reflective. They reflect a large portion of the sun's visible light, and crucially, its infrared radiation, which we feel as heat. By wearing light-colored garments, the ancient Egyptians were effectively deflecting a significant amount of the sun's radiant energy away from their bodies. In contrast, dark-colored clothing absorbs that same energy, converting it into heat and making the wearer feel much warmer. This simple choice of dye, or more often the lack thereof, meant their clothing actively worked to keep them cooler throughout the day. It was a passive, personal shading system, reducing the thermal load on their bodies and helping to prevent heat stress during long hours of labor in the fields, at construction sites, or on trading caravans. The versatility of the calasiris design also allowed for adaptation to different social stations and activity levels. A laborer or farmer might wear a shorter, simpler version of the garment, perhaps even just a linen kilt or a wraparound skirt, allowing for maximum freedom of movement. Their clothing was purely about function and surviving the physical demands of the day. For the nobility and royalty, the basic form remained the same, but the quality of the linen was vastly superior, woven to a much finer, almost transparent thread count that would feel incredibly light and smooth against the skin. They might also wear pleated garments, a style that suggests a surprising level of textile sophistication. The intricate, sharp pleats seen in statues of pharaohs and nobles weren't just for show, they increased the surface area of the fabric, which in turn enhanced its ability to circulate air and release heat. While the elite used these features for fashion, the underlying principle was rooted in the same thermal efficiency that guided the commoner's tunic. Whether coarse or fine, plain or pleated, the core concept was constant. Use linen's natural properties to create a microclimate next to the skin that was cooler, drier, and more comfortable than the harsh external world. This everyday garment, worn by millions over 3,000 years, stands as a testament to an intuitive understanding of material science and human physiology, proving that in ancient Egypt, even getting dressed in the morning was an act of brilliant environmental adaptation. But the Egyptians' personal cooling technology didn't stop at their clothing. They understood that protecting the body from the sun required a head-to-toe strategy, and their solutions for shielding the head and eyes were just as ingeniously practical. In a land where the sun beat down from a cloudless sky for most of the year, the head was especially vulnerable to both heatstroke and sunburn. While commoners might simply wrap a piece of linen around their heads as a basic turban, the most iconic piece of Egyptian headwear, the Nemes headdress worn by pharaohs like Tutankhamun, was a masterwork of functional design. It wasn't just a crown, it was a sophisticated piece of headgear engineering. Made from a large piece of striped cloth, typically linen stiffened with resin, it was tightly fitted to the head with two large lappets that fell forward over the shoulders and a long braided tail known as a queue down the back. The genius of this design lay in its multi-layered protection. The close fit covered the entire scalp, acting as a primary barrier against direct solar radiation. The thick, layered fabric provided substantial insulation, preventing the sun's heat from penetrating to the skull, but the most critical functional elements were those shoulder flaps and the tail. The two lappets hanging over the shoulders protected the sensitive side of the neck and the upper back, areas that are notoriously difficult to shade. Meanwhile, the long tail that fell down the spine served a dual purpose. It protected the back of the neck, a major area for heat absorption, and its weight helped anchor the entire headdress securely in place, even during windy conditions or physical activity. This was not a flimsy ceremonial piece. It was a stable, all-encompassing shield that effectively turned the pharaoh's head and upper body into a shaded, insulated zone, drastically reducing the risk of heat stress during long hours of public appearances or military reviews conducted under the blazing sun. This same principle of comprehensive coverage extended to the eyes, where the Egyptians developed one of their most famous and scientifically astute innovations, kohl eyeliner. If you look at any Egyptian statue or tomb painting, you'll see those strikingly dark, almond-shaped eyes outlined with a heavy black pigment. While this certainly had religious and aesthetic significance, representing the all-seeing eye of the god Horus, its primary daily function was starkly practical. It was essential eye protection. The Egyptian desert environment is one of extreme glare. The sun reflects mercilessly off the endless sand and limestone, creating a blinding brightness that can cause significant eye strain and even long-term damage. Furthermore, the air was often filled with fine, wind-blown dust and sand particles, as well as flies carrying bacteria that could cause painful eye infections like conjunctivitis. The application of kohl created a powerful defense against these threats. The thick, dark lines drawn around the eyes acted in a similar way to the black grease used by modern athletes. They helped to absorb incoming light, drastically reducing the sun's glare and cutting down on the blinding reflections that would otherwise make it difficult to see. This improved visual acuity in the harsh midday light, a critical advantage for anyone working outdoors, from a farmer surveying his fields to a soldier scanning the horizon. But the protection went even deeper. The primary ingredient in kohl was galena, a lead sulfide ore. For centuries, we assumed this was toxic, but recent biochemical research has revealed a fascinating truth. When the Egyptians applied kohl, the lead salts in the galena would react with the skin. This reaction would trigger the body's natural immune response, causing the cells in the skin around the eyes to produce a surge of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a potent antimicrobial molecule, so by applying coal, the Egyptians were essentially giving themselves a daily, low-dose topical antibiotic treatment that actively fought off the bacteria that caused infections, effectively protecting their eyes from the diseases carried by flies and dust. This wasn't just makeup, it was an ancient, functional form of medicinal protection, a brilliant fusion of cosmetic tradition and practical biochemistry that safeguarded one of their most vital senses. The materials they used for these personal items also reveal a deep understanding of their resources. Coal was not a single substance, but a carefully prepared cosmetic. They would grind the galena ore on a pallet into a fine powder, then mix it with water, oil, or animal fat to create a paste that could be applied with a small stick. This paste was stored in beautifully crafted containers made of wood, stone, or faience, often designed to be portable for easy reapplication throughout the day. For headwear, the choice of linen was again paramount. Its breathability prevented sweat from accumulating under the headdress, which could lead to skin irritation and heat rash. For those who could afford it, some headdresses may have incorporated other materials. While the classic Nimes was cloth, other royal crowns like the pichent or double crown were likely made of more rigid materials, but their very structure still provided a physical barrier against the sun, creating a protected microclimate for the ruler's head. From the humblest laborers' linen headscarf to the pharaoh's ornate Nimes, and the coal-lined eyes of every social class, the ancient Egyptians demonstrated that personal protection was a science. They turned everyday items into proactive tools for survival, ensuring that they could live, work, and thrive in an environment that offered no respite from the power of the sun. Of course, all this brilliant technology for water, shelter, and clothing would mean very little if you couldn't preserve the very food that gave you the energy to use them. In a climate where intense heat and scavenging insects could turn a day's catch or harvest into a putrid, inedible mess within hours, the ancient Egyptians developed a sophisticated culinary arsenal against spoilage. Their methods were straightforward yet incredibly effective, harnessing the very elements of their harsh environment, the relentless sun and the mineral-rich desert, to create a stable, long-lasting food supply. They essentially turned the challenges of their world into the tools for their survival, mastering preservation techniques that revolved around three key principles: removing moisture, creating hostile environments for bacteria, and leveraging the natural chemistry of precious substances. The most fundamental and widespread of these techniques was drying, or desiccation. The Egyptians had a powerful, zero-cost energy source for this process blazing down on them every single day: the sun. They would take fish straight from the Nile's bounty species like Nile perch and catfish and simply clean them, split them open, and lay them out on broad, flat racks or directly on hot, clean sand. Under the scorching sun, the moisture inside the fish would evaporate rapidly, leaving behind a tough, shriveled, but completely stable product. This same method was applied to meat, such as cuts of beef or duck, and even to certain fruits like figs and grapes, which would become the early precursors to raisins. The science behind it was simple but flawless. By removing the water, they were removing the essential ingredient that bacteria, yeast, and mold need to grow and thrive. A thoroughly dried piece of fish could be stored for months in a simple pottery jar or a woven basket, providing a crucial source of protein during times when fishing was poor or for long-distance travel and military campaigns. This wasn't just a way to avoid waste. It was a strategy for food security, creating a non-perishable calorie reserve that could see a family or an entire workforce through lean periods. But for some foods, especially meats that were richer in fat, simple drying wasn't always sufficient. This is where their second major preservation method came into play, one that involved a valuable resource extracted from the edges of their world: salt. The Egyptians had access to immense natural deposits in the western desert, particularly from places like the Wadi el Natron, a valley whose name literally means Valley of Natron. They would harvest this salt, as well as a related substance called natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, and use it in vast quantities. The process, known as salting or curing, was a chemical masterstroke. They would pack meat or fish in layers of dry salt or submerge it in a concentrated brine solution. The salt acted through a process called osmosis, drawing the water out of the cells of the meat and the cells of any microorganisms on its surface. This dual action dehydrated the meat while simultaneously creating an environment so saline that it was literally toxic to most spoilage bacteria. The result was a preserved product that not only lasted indefinitely, but also developed a distinct, savory flavor. The scale on which they operated reveals how central this was to their economy. Evidence from workmen's villages, like the one at Deir el-Medina, shows large-scale facilities for salting and drying fish, likely to feed the hundreds of artisans building the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Salted fish became a staple protein for the lower and middle classes, a food that could be easily transported and required no further preservation. The use of natron was particularly ingenious because it had a dual purpose. While it was excellent for preserving food, it was also the very same substance they used in the mummification process to desiccate and preserve human and animal bodies. The line between culinary preservation and spiritual eternity was surprisingly thin. The same chemical knowledge that kept a worker fed for a day was also used to ensure a pharaoh's body endured for eternity. This connection highlights a profound understanding of practical chemistry, applied seamlessly from the kitchen to the tomb. Then there was their sweetest and most versatile preservative, honey. The ancient Egyptians were avid beekeepers, with hieroglyphs depicting scenes of beekeepers smoking hives and carefully extracting honeycombs from cylindrical tubular hive. Honey was far more than a simple sweetener. It was recognized as a miraculous substance that never spoiled. Its preservative power lies in its unique chemical composition. Honey is overwhelmingly sugary, creating a high osmotic pressure environment that, much like salt, draws moisture out of any microbial cells, causing them to shrivel and die. Even more remarkably, honey naturally contains trace amounts of hydrogen peroxide, a known antiseptic, which is released slowly when honey is diluted, providing an ongoing defense against bacterial growth. The Egyptians exploited these properties brilliantly. They would pack fruits such as dates and figs, and even pieces of meat, in jars filled with honey. The honey created an airtight, antimicrobial seal around the food, perfectly preserving its texture and flavor for years. Archaeological evidence suggests they even used honey in embalming, applying it to wounds to prevent infection, showing they understood its antibacterial nature on a very practical level. This trio of preservation methods, drying, salting, and honey, allowed Egyptian society to achieve a level of food stability that was remarkable for the ancient world. It enabled the storage of massive agricultural surpluses, which were the foundation of state power, used to pay laborers and feed the army. It made long-distance trade and exploration possible, as caravans could carry lightweight, nutrient-dense dried foods and honey-preserved delicacies across vast desert. It even influenced their cuisine, creating signature dishes like a salted fish relish that was a common seasoning. By mastering these techniques, they transformed their relationship with time itself, no longer being slaves to the immediate spoilage of their harvest. They could plan for the future, endure famine, and embark on grand projects, all because they had learned the simple yet profound art of making food endure in a land where everything else was constantly being weathered by the sun and sand. Yet, even with reliable food preservation and comfortable clothing, survival in ancient Egypt depended on something far more fundamental and abstract: the ability to predict the future. Imagine being a farmer, your family's life and livelihood tied completely to the land. Your entire year, your very existence, hinges on a single, monumental event: the annual flooding of the Nile. If the river rises too early, it could wash away your young crops. If it arrives too late, the seeds you've sown will wither in the parched soil. If the flood is too weak, the land won't receive enough water and fertile silt, leading to a meager harvest and potential famine. Living at the mercy of such a powerful, unpredictable force would be a constant state of anxiety. The ancient Egyptians solved this existential problem with one of their most profound and enduring intellectual achievements: the creation of the world's first reliable solar calendar. This wasn't merely a way to mark the days. It was a predictive engine, a grand cosmic clock that allowed them to synchronize their entire society with the rhythm of the universe itself. The story of this calendar begins not in a palace or a temple, but in the endless expanse of the night sky. Long before they built pyramids, the early Egyptians were meticulous astronomers. They carefully observed that the brightest star in the heavens, Sirius, which they called Sopdet, or Sothis in Greek, would disappear below the horizon for a period of about 70 days each year. Then, just before dawn one morning, in what we now call mid-July, Sirius would miraculously reappear, gleaming just above the eastern horizon moments before the sun rose. This event, known as the heliacal rising of Sirius, was not just a beautiful celestial spectacle. The Egyptians made a world-changing connection. This reappearance of the dog star consistently coincided with the very beginning of the Nile's annual inundation. After generations of observation, they confirmed this correlation was not a coincidence, but a reliable celestial herald. The star's return signaled the imminent arrival of the life-giving flood, a moment of rebirth for the entire land. This celestial event became their absolute anchor point, the true and immutable New Year's Day, which they called the opening of the year. Armed with this celestial clockwork, Egyptian scholar-priests set about constructing a formal calendar. They understood that the cycle from one heliacal rising of Sirius to the next was approximately 365 days. This was a monumental realization. While many ancient cultures used lunar calendars based on the phases of the moon, those calendars quickly fell out of sync with the solar year and the all-important agricultural seasons. A lunar year is only about 354 days long, creating a significant drift over just a few years. The Egyptian decision to base their civil calendar on the solar cycle was a deliberate and pragmatic choice to keep their society perfectly aligned with the seasonal realities of their environment. They divided this 365-day year into 12 months of 30 days each, resulting in 360 days. To account for the extra 5¼ days, they simply added 5 extra days at the end of the year. These were known as the epigonal days, and they were considered to be the birthdays of the major gods Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, and Nephthys, a time outside of normal time, filled with a celebration and a touch of divine danger. The entire structure of their year was then divided into 3 seasons, each with 4 months, that were defined entirely by the Nile and the agricultural work it demanded. The first season was Akhet, the inundation, which began with the new year and the rising of Sirius. This was when the Nile overflowed its banks, transforming the valley into a vast, shallow lake and depositing its rich, black silt. During this time, much of the farming population was freed up for other colossal state projects, like pyramid construction. Next came Perit, the emergence or going forth, when the waters receded and the fertile black land, Kemet, emerged damp and ready for planting. This was the season of sowing, when every available hand was in the fields. Finally, there was Shemu, the harvest or dryness, the season of intense heat when the crops were gathered and the land began to bake under the relentless sun. This calendar provided the entire kingdom with a shared, predictable schedule. From the pharaoh's administrators in the capital to the farmers in the most remote village, everyone knew precisely what time of the year it was and what tasks needed to be performed. It eliminated guesswork and created a harmonious, society-wide rhythm for labor, taxation, and religious festivals. The practical impact of this system on survival and prosperity cannot be overstated. The calendar's predictive power was their ultimate defense against famine. By knowing almost to the day when the flood would arrive, the central government could orchestrate a coordinated national agricultural strategy. Officials could ensure that irrigation canals and catchment basins were cleared and repaired in the weeks leading up to Akhet. Seed grain from state granaries could be distributed to farmers just before Perit began. The entire planting schedule for emmer wheat and barley could be optimized for maximum yield, ensuring the crops matured before the extreme heat of Shemu set in. This precise timing allowed them to consistently produce the massive agricultural surplus that fed the cities, the army, and the thousands of laborers who built Egypt's monuments. Without this calendar, their civilization would have been perpetually reactive, scrambling to adapt to a capricious river. With it, They became masters of their own destiny, able to plan years in advance with a confidence that few ancient cultures ever possessed. It was the invisible framework upon which their entire society was built, a testament to their belief that by understanding the heavens, they could secure their life on earth. But if the river was their lifeblood and the calendar their guide, they still needed the physical tools to build their world, to connect their society, and to record their knowledge. For that, they turned to a single, extraordinary plant that grew in the marshy fringes of the Nile itself, papyrus. This wasn't just a common reed, it was the closest thing the ancient Egyptians had to a miracle material, a versatile resource so fundamental that it became the literal paper on which their civilization was written. Imagine a plant that could provide the means to travel, to build, to write, to wear, and even to eat. Papyrus was all of that, a humble swamp grass that they transformed into the backbone of their material culture, ingeniously unlocking 1,000 different uses from its tough, triangular stalk. The plant itself, Cyperus papyrus, was a majestic sight, forming dense green thickets along the riverbanks. It could grow to impressive heights, often reaching 15 feet or more, topped with a graceful, feathery umbel that looked like a delicate, spoken green fountain. But the real magic was hidden in its stem. If you were to cut one of those tall stalks, you'd find a cross-section that was distinctly triangular, not round. This unique shape contributed to its structural strength. More importantly, inside that tough green outer rind, the stem was filled with a soft, white, spongy pith. This pith was the key to papyrus's most famous use, but the Egyptians were far too practical to waste any part of the plant. They saw every fiber, every strand, as a potential resource, and their approach to harvesting and processing it was a testament to their resourcefulness. One of its most immediate and vital applications was in transportation. Before large wooden ships were built from imported cedar, the Egyptians took to the water on vessels made from papyrus. They would bundle the long stalks together, tying them tightly with papyrus rope to create buoyant, sturdy hulls. These boats were remarkably well suited to the shallow, marshy waters of the Nile Delta. Their flexible, bundled construction could absorb impacts that would shatter a rigid wooden hull, allowing them to glide over submerged obstacles without taking on water. Fishermen used small, nimble papyrus skiffs to cast their nets in the reedy shallows, while larger versions, sometimes equipped with a simple square sail, were used for transporting goods and people up and down the river. These vessels were the original workhorses of the Nile, connecting villages and enabling trade and communication long before the age of the great pharaonic barges. The very material that grew in the water became the means to master it, but you couldn't build a boat without rope, and once again, papyrus provided the answer. The long, fibrous stalks were perfect for cordage. To make rope, workers would peel away the tough outer rind of the plant, which contained long, flexible fibers. These fibers were then soaked to make them more pliable before being twisted and braided together into strands of various thicknesses. The resulting rope was incredibly strong and durable, resistant to the rotting effects of constant moisture. This papyrus rope was indispensable. It was used to lash together the planks of the great wooden ships that sailed the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. It secured cargo on donkeys and in river barges. It was vital in construction, used for hauling massive stone blocks up ramps during the building of the pyramids. In the hands of an Egyptian sailor, a farmer, or a builder, papyrus rope was the unbreakable thread that literally held their world together, from the mightiest monument to the simplest fishing net. Of course, the most revolutionary use for papyrus was for writing. The invention of papyrus sheet, the direct ancestor of paper, was a technological leap that transformed administration, literature, and religion. The process of making it was a specialized craft, a carefully guarded sequence of steps. Artisans would start by cutting the pith from inside the stalks into thin, vertical strips. These strips were then laid side by side on a hard, absorbent surface, forming a horizontal layer. A second layer of strips was then laid vertically on top of the first. This cross-hatched arrangement, with fibers running in perpendicular directions, was crucial for the sheet's strength. The two layers were then pounded together with a mallet, which mashed the plant's natural starches and sap, acting as a glue to bind the sheet. Finally, the sheet was pressed and dried in the sun, resulting in a smooth, pale, and incredibly durable writing surface. This invention of papyrus paper, or papyrus rolls, cannot be overstated in its importance. For the first time in history, there was a lightweight, relatively inexpensive, and portable medium for writing. Compared to carving hieroglyphs into stone or painting on heavy pottery shards, papyrus was a revelation. Scribes could now write quickly and fluidly with a reed brush and ink, recording everything from tax collections and legal decrees to epic poems and medical texts. It allowed for the creation of lengthy documents, which were then glued together into long scrolls that could be easily stored, transported, and read. This facilitated the growth of a complex, literate bureaucracy that could manage a nation-state. It allowed knowledge to be preserved and transmitted across generations with unprecedented fidelity. Without papyrus, the intricate details of Egyptian government, science, and daily life would be largely lost to us. It was the medium that gave their voice permanence. Yet the utility of this wonder plant extended right down to the ground people walked on. The same fibrous rind used for rope could be woven into other everyday items. The Egyptians crafted sturdy sandals by weaving papyrus fibers into a sole that was then attached to the foot with leather or papyrus straps. These sandals were lightweight, breathable, and provided a protective barrier between the foot and the scorching hot sand. Papyrus was also used to make mats for sitting and sleeping, baskets for storage and carrying goods, and even boxes and small furniture. The stalks could be bound together to create lightweight columns for simple structures or lattices for garden shade. In the hands of an Egyptian artisan, papyrus was as versatile as wood, fabric, or plastic might be to us today. And in a final testament to their no-waste philosophy, the Egyptians even found a culinary use for the plant. The soft, starchy pith from the center of the stalk, the same material used to make paper, was also edible. It could be eaten raw, though it was likely quite bland, or it could be cooked. Historical accounts suggest it was sometimes roasted over fire or boiled. While it was probably not a dietary staple for most, it would have been a reliable, readily available source of nutrition for those living and working in the marshy areas where it grew, such as fishermen, hunters, and papyrus harvesters themselves. From the hull of a boat to the sole of a sandal, from a royal decree to a simple meal, the papyrus plant was seamlessly integrated into every level of Egyptian life, a true cornerstone of a civilization built on intelligent adaptation. But beyond the plants they cultivated and the tools they engineered, the ancient Egyptians forged another kind of alliance that was absolutely fundamental to their survival, a partnership with the animals they domesticated. This wasn't merely about keeping livestock. It was about integrating other species into a symbiotic support system, where each creature played a distinct and indispensable role in the grand machine of their civilization. The donkey, the cow, and even the cat weren't just pets or livestock. They were co-survivors, biological technologies that extended human capabilities in ways that stone and papyrus alone never could. They were the living, breathing engines of the economy and the silent guardians of daily life, transforming the monumental challenge of desert living into a manageable, collaborative effort. At the forefront of this animal workforce was the humble donkey, the undisputed powerhouse of overland transport in the ancient world. Long before the camel became common in Egypt around the Persian period, it was the donkey that connected the isolated ribbon of the Nile Valley to the wider world. These animals were biological marvels of endurance, perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions that would break other beasts of burden. They could thrive on sparse, rough forage that camels would turn their noses up at, and their small, hard hooves were ideal for navigating the rocky, unstable terrain of desert wadis and mountain passes. Their true genius, however, lay in their incredible water efficiency. A donkey could travel for days on a single watering, its metabolism expertly conserving every precious drop, allowing it to traverse vast stretches of arid land where a human alone would perish. This made them the irreplaceable linchpin of Egyptian trade and expansion. The scale of their importance is staggering to consider. Massive donkey caravans, sometimes consisting of hundreds of animals, were the 18-wheelers of the Bronze Age. They formed the vital supply lines that fueled Egypt's economy and its most ambitious projects. From the turquoise and copper mines of the Sinai Peninsula, donkeys would carry back loads of raw metal essential for tools and weapons. From the gold-rich valleys of the eastern desert, they transported the very bedrock of pharaonic wealth and power. These caravans also followed established routes to distant oases in the western desert, like Dakta and Karga, bringing back exotic goods and connecting isolated communities to the heartland. Perhaps most critically, they enabled long-distance trade with powerful neighbors like Nubia to the south, from which they acquired gold, ivory, and ebony, and with the Levant to the northeast, a source of coveted cedar wood and resins. Without the donkey's relentless, plodding strength, Egypt would have remained an isolated river culture. With it, they built a vast economic network that stretched across continents, all powered by the steady, reliable pace of these unsung heroes of the desert. While the donkey conquered the deserts outside, another domesticated animal provided the nutritional foundation within the Nile Valley itself: cattle. The relationship between the Egyptians and their cattle was deep, complex, and foundational to their entire society. From the earliest times, cattle were a walking, breathing measure of wealth and status. But their value was profoundly practical, providing a sustained and renewable source of nutrition that was far more versatile than hunting wild game. The primary gift of the cow was its milk, a liquid staple that could be consumed fresh or, just as importantly, transformed through simple processing. The Egyptians were masters of dairy, regularly making yogurt by allowing milk to ferment in the heat, and cheese by curdling it and pressing the solids. These preserved dairy products provided a stable source of protein, fat, and calories that could be stored for much longer than fresh milk, feeding families and laborers throughout the year. The role of cattle, however, extended far beyond their milk. While they were not slaughtered for meat on a daily basis, their value as living assets was too great. Their meat was a crucial part of the diet, especially for the elite and during religious festivals and state-sponsored events. Tomb scenes frequently depict the ritual slaughter of oxen, and the meat was a standard provision for the workmen building the royal tombs. But the utility of the animal was thoroughly comprehensive in a way that exemplifies the Egyptian no-waste philosophy. After slaughter, nothing was discarded. The hide was tanned into durable leather for sandals, shields, military tents, and the covers for chariots. The sinews were used for bowstrings and bindings. The bones and horns were carved into tools, ornaments, and cosmetic containers. Even the fat was rendered for use in cooking, lamp fuel, and unguent. The cow was a self-contained resource factory, and its domestication provided a consistent, multi-purpose material base that supported everything from a soldier's gear to a scribe's inkwell. Yet, securing all this food, the grain from the fields, the dairy in the storerooms, created a new and persistent problem: vermin. This is where one of the most famous and deified of Egyptian animals enters the story, not as a god, but first and foremost as a supremely skilled pest control expert, the cat. In a land where the annual harvest was the difference between prosperity and famine, protecting the vast state and household granaries from rats, mice, and snakes was a matter of national security. The African wildcat, a solitary and territorial creature, was naturally drawn to the concentrations of rodents that gathered around human grain stores. The Egyptians, being keen observers of nature, recognized the immense value of this small predator. Over generations, a mutually beneficial relationship developed. Humans provided a consistent, easy food source in the form of vermin, and the cats provided a silent, efficient, and self-replicating defense system for the food supply. The domestication of the cat was a slow process of cohabitation and trust. Unlike dogs or donkeys, cats were never truly tamed in the same way. They essentially domesticated themselves by choosing to live near humans. The Egyptians appreciated their independent nature and their incredible skill. A single cat could patrol a granary and eliminate dozens of destructive rodents in a night, saving enough grain to feed multiple families. This practical, economic service was so vital that it elevated the cat from a useful animal to a revered one. To harm a cat was a serious crime, and the export of cats was initially forbidden to protect this strategic resource. Their deification as the goddess Bastet, depicted as a lioness or a woman with a cat's head, grew directly from this foundational role as a protector. She represented the fierce, nurturing, and protective aspects of feline nature, qualities that safeguarded the home, the harvest, and by extension, the entire nation. The cat's journey from a wild hunter on the desert's edge to a cherished resident in every home is a perfect symbol of the Egyptian survival strategy. Observe a natural solution, foster a symbiotic relationship, and in doing so, turn a potential threat into a loyal guardian of your civilization. While the plants and animals formed the living foundation of their society, the ancient Egyptians also mastered the very earth beneath their feet to forge the tools that would shape their world. This brings us to one of the most transformative technological leaps in human history, the smelting and working of copper. In a land rich with golden sand and black soil, it was the glint of green malachite and azurite stones scattered in the eastern desert that unlocked a new age of possibility. The Egyptians discovered that these beautiful, colorful rocks held a secret. When heated in a hot enough fire, a mysterious, lustrous liquid would weep from the stone. If they channeled this liquid into a waiting mold, it would cool into a solid, malleable, and incredibly versatile metal, copper. This is not just a new material, it was a new kind of power. It allowed them to move beyond the limitations of stone and bone, crafting tools with a sharpness, durability, and precision that were previously unimaginable, tools that would become the literal edge they needed to sculpt a civilization from the desert. The process of turning desert rock into a usable tool was a sophisticated alchemy that combined careful observation with controlled fire. It began with mining, where laborers used stone hammers and fire, heating rock with fire, and then dousing it with water to cause it to crack, to extract the copper ore from veins in the cliffs of places like the Sinai Peninsula and the Eastern Desert. Back at a specialized workshop or smelting site, the raw ore would be crushed into a powder using heavy stone mortars. This powdered ore was then mixed with charcoal, a carbon-rich fuel that burns much hotter than wood, and placed inside a clay furnace. A craftsman, or more likely a team of them, would then use ceramic blowpipes or bellows made from animal skins to force a continuous stream of air into the furnace, stoking the flames to temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. At this incredible heat, a chemical reaction occurred. The charcoal would strip the oxygen atoms away from the copper atoms in the ore, and the pure liquid copper metal, being heavier, would trickle down to the bottom of the furnace, separating from the worthless rocky slag that floated on top. This molten copper was then carefully tapped out, or the furnace was broken open to retrieve a rough, impure ingot known as a bloom. This raw copper was then ready for the next stage, alloying and casting. While the Egyptians initially worked with pure copper, they soon discovered that by adding a small amount of another metal, typically tin, they could create bronze, an alloy that was harder, held a sharper edge, and was less brittle. To craft a specific tool, the metalworker would use a two-part mold, often carved from stone or made of fired clay. The molten copper or bronze would be poured into this mold through a small channel. Once it cooled and solidified, the mold was opened to reveal the rough shape of the tool: a chisel, an axe head, or a saw blade. The final and most critical step was hammering. The craftsman would heat the cast object again and then hammer it repeatedly on a stone anvil. This process, called work hardening, compacted the metal's molecular structure, making it significantly harder and tougher. Finally, the edge would be ground and sharpened on an abrasive sandstone block, resulting in a tool that was ready to take on the hardest materials their world had to offer. The impact of these copper and bronze tools on construction was nothing short of revolutionary. Before metal, shaping the massive limestone and granite blocks for pyramids and temples was a grueling, almost Sisyphean task with stone hammers and electric hammers. Copper chisels changed everything. A worker could now set a sharp copper chisel against a stone block and strike it with a stone hammer, creating a controlled fracture or carving precise hieroglyphs with a finesse that was simply impossible before. But the real game changer for monumental architecture was the copper saw. These were not like modern serrated saws. They were long, flat blades of copper, often without teeth. Their cutting power didn't come from serrations, but from an abrasive slurry, as one or two workers pulled the saw back and forth, assistant to pour a mixture of sand and water into the cut. The hard quartz particles in the sand did the actual cutting, while the copper saw served as a carrier, grinding its way through even the hardest granite over hours or days of painstaking labor. This same method, using copper drills with abrasive slurry, allowed them to bore perfect holes through stone for dowels and to hollow out the interiors of stone vessels and sarcophagi with astonishing precision. Without the durability and malleability of copper, the iconic smooth-sided pyramids and the intricately carved temple walls would have remained mere fantasies. This technological revolution extended from the grandest monuments down to the most essential crafts of daily life. In woodworking, copper axes and adzes made the felling of trees and the rough shaping of timber exponentially faster. Carpenters used copper chisels and pull saws to create the intricate joinery for furniture, coffins, and the great wooden ships that sailed the Nile and the Mediterranean. The lightweight, bundled papyrus boats were perfect for the marshes, but for trading expeditions to the Levant for cedar wood or military campaigns down the Nubian Nile, large, sturdy wooden ships were essential. These vessels, with their complex hulls and decks, were entirely dependent on copper tools for their construction. The same tools that built a pharaoh's funeral barge also built the fishing skiffs and river ferries that connected everyday Egyptian communities. The versatility of copper even extended to the delicate art of textile production. Women used finely crafted copper needles to weave and sew linen clothing, creating the very garments that were essential for surviving the desert heat. From the shipwright to the seamstress, copper tools elevated craftsmanship, increased productivity, and improved the quality and complexity of goods available to all levels of society. Perhaps one of the most surprising and profound applications of this metal was in the field of medicine. The Egyptians developed a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and surgery, and their medical toolkit was filled with specialized copper instruments. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the world's oldest surgical texts, describes procedures for setting broken bones, treating wounds, and even performing rudimentary surgeries. For these delicate operations, Egyptian physicians used copper scalpels with razor-sharp edges for making clean incisions, copper probes for exploring wounds, and copper needles for stitching lacerations. The metal's natural properties were critically important here. While they wouldn't have understood germ theory, we now know that copper surfaces have inherent oligodynamic properties, meaning they naturally kill bacteria and other microorganisms on contact. A copper surgical tool, even by accident, would have been significantly more hygienic than one made from stone or bone, leading to a lower chance of infection and better patient outcomes. This application shows a holistic understanding of the material's potential, leveraging its physical sharpness and its subtle antibacterial qualities to heal the human body, proving that their technological prowess was applied with equal ingenuity to saving lives as it was to building tombs. With the Nile's life-giving current already guiding their world, the Egyptians looked upward to harness another powerful force, the wind. Their mastery of river travel wasn't merely about floating with the flow, it was about creating a two-way highway by understanding and exploiting the very air that moved above the water. This insight led them to develop some of the most efficient sailing vessels of the ancient world, a fleet that ranged from humble, bundled reed skiffs to majestic wooden ships capable of carrying obelisks. The genius of their nautical design lay in a perfect marriage of geography and physics. They recognized that while the Nile's current flowed consistently northward toward the Mediterranean, the prevailing winds over Egypt blew just as reliably from the north. This created a natural, reciprocal transportation system. To travel south, upstream against the current, a crew would simply raise a single, large square sail, capturing the steady northerly breeze to push them against the flow with remarkable efficiency. To travel north, downstream, they would lower the sail and mast, allowing the current to carry them effortlessly, while crews used long poles or paddles for steering. This elegant dance with wind and current turned the Nile into the world's most predictable and manageable aquatic freeway, enabling not just local trade, but the very unification and administration of a nation stretching over 700 miles. At the most fundamental level, the Egyptians' relationship with the water began with the papyrus reed boat. Constructed from bundles of the ubiquitous papyrus plant, these lightweight and flexible vessels were the workhorses of the marshlands and the original model for all later ship design. Artisans would gather long papyrus stalks and tie them tightly together, first forming a thick, buoyant bundle for the hull. They would then curve the ends upward sharply, securing them to create the distinctive and graceful sickle shape seen in countless tomb paintings. This raised prow and stern weren't just for aesthetics. They helped the boat cut through the reeds and made it easier to ride over waves rather than plow through them. The flexibility of the bundled construction was its greatest asset. In the shallow, obstacle-filled waters of the delta marshes, a rigid wooden boat could be easily holed and sunk by a submerged log. A papyrus boat, however, would simply bend and yield, absorbing the impact and remaining afloat. Fishermen used these silent, nimble craft to set their nets among the reeds, while hunters pursued waterfowl through the dense papyrus forest. Even children learned to navigate the river's edge in small papyrus skiffs. This early, accessible technology ensured that from the poorest villager to the nobleman on a hunting expedition, the river was a familiar and navigable part of daily life. As the demands of state projects, long-distance trade, and military expeditions grew, so too did the scale and complexity of Egyptian shipbuilding, leading to a monumental transition from reed to wood. While the basic hull shape, with its upward curving ends, remained, the materials shifted to imported cedar from Lebanon and local acacia and sycamore fig. The construction of these wooden ships was a masterpiece of ancient engineering, relying on a technique that seems counterintuitive today. They were built shell first, without an internal keel. Instead of starting with the skeleton frame, shipwrights would first lay the planks for the hull, expertly shaping them to form the vessel's curved body. They would then join these planks using a system of mortise and tenon joints interlocking wooden tabs and slots that were secured with durable wooden pegs. This method created an incredibly strong, rigid hull, essentially a massive wooden puzzle locked together. Only after the shell was complete would internal ribs and crossbeams be added for additional bracing. These crossbeams, known as thwarts, also served as seats for the rowers, who provided the primary power for these ships when the wind was not favorable. This sophisticated construction technique produced vessels that were both seaworthy and capacious, capable of carrying multi-ton stone blocks for pyramid construction or embarking on trading voyages across the open Mediterranean Sea. The true heart of their sailing efficiency, however, was the unique rigging and sail design. The iconic Egyptian sail was a broad, single square sail made from heavy linen panels sewn together. It was suspended from a long, two-legged mast known as a bipod mast. This frame structure distributed the immense strain of the sail across a wider section of the hull, providing superior stability compared to a single pole mast, especially crucial in the gusty conditions of the Nile. The sail was controlled by a complex system of brailed lines, a revolutionary innovation. Rather than having to lower the entire heavy sail to reduce its area in strong winds, sailors could simply pull on these lines, which were run through rings attached to the canvas. This would gather the sail up against the yardarm like a curtain, quickly and easily reducing its effective size to match the wind conditions. This gave Egyptian sailors unparalleled control, allowing them to adjust their power instantly to navigate the river's variable breezes and sudden squalls. With the bipod mast providing stability and the brailing lines offering precision control, they could harness every possible breath of the north wind for their journey south. The importance of these vessels extended far beyond simple transportation. They were the vital circulatory system of the Egyptian state. Massive cargo ships, some over 100 feet long, were the floating trucks of the ancient world. They transported grain from the fertile estates of the north to the administrative centers in the south, fulfilling tax obligations and feeding the populations of cities like Thebes and Memphis. They carried the colossal limestone and granite blocks for temples and pyramids, with some barges specifically designed to be submerged so that the stone blocks could be floated over them and then secured as the barge was refloated. The military also depended entirely on its navy. Fast, sleek vessels, powered by both sail and oars, allowed for the rapid deployment of troops along the river, securing Egypt's long, vulnerable borders. These ships could patrol the Nile, intercepting smuggling and preventing incursions from the desert tribes. The ability to move soldiers and supplies quickly via the river gave the pharaohs a strategic advantage that helped maintain central control over a vast and sprawling kingdom for thousands of years. This mastery of the river also paved the way for epic voyages beyond Egypt's borders, launching expeditions that brought back immense wealth and exotic goods. One of the most famous of these was the expedition to the land of Punt, a trading partner believed to be located somewhere on the Red Sea coast of modern-day Somalia or Eritrea. The reliefs at the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri depict this incredible journey in vivid detail. They show a fleet of large, sea-going vessels, each equipped with a single square sail and many oars, making the arduous journey. To reach Punt, the Egyptians would not sail down the Red Sea directly from a Nile port. Instead, they would build their ships on the Nile, then disassemble them and transport the pieces in a massive overland caravan across the desert to a port on the Red Sea coast. There, the ships would be reassembled and launched into the open ocean. This monumental logistical effort was undertaken for the treasures of Punt, fragrant myrrh and frankincense resins essential for temple rituals, precious ebony wood, ivory tusks, live incense trees to be replanted in Egypt, and exotic animal skin. The success of such ventures, entirely dependent on their advanced naval architecture and navigational skills, brought not just material wealth, but also immense prestige, reinforcing the pharaoh's role as a divine ruler who could command the very seas. These ships, born on the Nile, became the bridges to a wider world, connecting Egypt to the sources of luxury and power that cemented its status as a legendary civilization. Yet, for all the power of the Nile and the ingenuity of its ships, the true test of Egyptian reach was measured in the vast, silent expanse of the western desert. This was the realm of the Red Land, an ocean of sand and stone where survival depended on one thing above all else: finding water. Scattered across this formidable landscape were a series of miraculous islands in a sea of sand, the oases. Far from being mere dots on a map, places like the Dakta and Karga oases were engineered into a sophisticated network of strategic outposts, functioning as the vital nodes that connected Egypt to the wider world and secured its flanks against the encroaching void. They were not just natural features, they were active, managed extensions of pharaonic power, transforming a geographic barrier into a functioning corridor of commerce, communication, and control. The very existence of these oases is a geological marvel. They are not fed by rare desert rains, but by a colossal fossil aquifer, a vast underground sea of fresh water trapped deep beneath the sandstone bedrock. In a few fortunate places, the land has fractured, allowing this ancient water to well up to the surface through natural springs or to be accessed by digging wells. The Egyptians recognized these life-giving patches not as random accidents, but as strategic assets of immense value. The two most significant were the Karga Oasis, the southernmost and closest to the Nile Valley, and the Dakta Oasis, lying further out into the desert. Karga served as the primary gateway. Its location made it the first major stop on the overland route known as the Darb el Arbain, the 40 Days Road, a trade route that stretched all the way into the heart of Sudan. Dakta, being larger and more fertile, became a major agricultural and administrative center in its own right. The pharaohs, understanding their importance, invested heavily in fortifying and developing these islands in the sand, turning them from simple watering holes into fortified way stations that guaranteed safe passage for the lifeblood of Egypt's economy, the Great Trade Caravan. Imagine a caravan of donkeys, hundreds strong, emerging from the blinding haze of the desert. For days, the travelers have endured scorching days and freezing nights, navigating by the stars across a featureless plain. The sight of the distant palm groves of an oasis would have been a vision of salvation. These way stations were not just places to drink, they were full-service desert ports. Here, caravan leaders could pay taxes or tolls to Egyptian officials stationed at a small mud brick fort. Exhausted donkeys could be rested, fed, and even replaced with fresh animals. The travelers themselves could find shelter, trade news, and acquire supplies for the next, even more daunting leg of the journey. The oases provided critical supplies that were unavailable elsewhere. Local farmers cultivated dates in vast quantities, a fruit that was not only a sweet and nutritious food, but also one that dried perfectly, becoming a calorie-dense, non-perishable travel ration essential for surviving long desert crossings. Beyond dates, the oases were famous for another luxury, wine. Vineyards flourished in the unique microclimates of Dakta and Karga, producing a distinct desert wine that was prized back in the Nile Valley. A caravan departing an oasis would therefore be laden not only with gold, ivory, and exotic woods from the south, but also with the unique products of the oasis itself, making these hubs both a destination and a point of origin. To secure this flow of wealth, the Egyptian state established a permanent military and administrative presence. Along the routes leading into Karga Oasis, they constructed a chain of mud brick fortresses. These were not vast citadels for large armies, but rather well-guarded supply depots and police posts. Their purpose was threefold: to protect the water sources from raiding desert tribes, to monitor and tax the goods moving along the trade routes, and to project the authority of the pharaoh into this otherwise lawless frontier. Soldiers stationed at these remote outposts lived a lonely and demanding life, but their role was crucial. They ensured that the caravans of the Darb el-Arbain could operate with a degree of security, which in turn encouraged more trade and brought more wealth into Egypt. This military infrastructure turned the oases from passive stops into actively managed territories, integrating them fully into the economic and defensive system of the state. The presence of an Egyptian official in a desert fort hundreds of miles from the Nile was a powerful statement. Nowhere was beyond the reach of the pharaoh's power. This function of the oases as a place of pharaonic control had another, darker dimension. They served as places of exile and forced labor. The very remoteness that made the oases strategically vital also made them an ideal destination for those the state wished to remove from the heartland. Political rivals, convicted criminals, and prisoners of war could be sent to these distant settlements. Forced to labor in the oasis vineyards or in the maintenance of the caravan routes, these exiles were effectively erased from the society of the Nile Valley while simultaneously being used to develop the state's assets on the frontier. This practice highlights the dual nature of the oasis network. For the merchant, it was a lifeline; for the soldier, a posting; but for the exile, it was a prison. The lush palm groves and bubbling springs could be a place of salvation or a gilded cage, depending on who you were and why you were sent there. This complex role underscores how the Egyptians used geography as a tool of social and political management, leveraging the desert's inherent isolation to reinforce their authority. Beyond their immediate practical uses, the Western desert oases held a profound spiritual significance. In a culture that saw the divine in the landscape, an oasis was more than a resource. It was a manifestation of the god's benevolence in the land of the dead. The endless desert was associated with chaos and danger, the realm of the god Set, the antagonist of the divine order. An oasis, therefore, was a miraculous pocket of order, Amat, in the heart of chaos. This spiritual connection is powerfully embodied at the Temple of Amun at Hibis in the Karga Oasis. Built during the Persian period, but on a site of ancient reverence, this temple stands as a monumental declaration of Egyptian sovereignty over the desert. Its very existence, a massive stone structure rising from the sand, was a symbolic act of conquering the chaos of the Red Land. Pilgrimages to such oasis temples reinforced the idea that the pharaoh's power and the god's favor extended to the very edges of the world. The network of oases was, therefore, not just a logistical or economic system, but a sacred geography, a chain of sanctuaries that spiritually tamed the desert and wove it into the cosmic order of the Egyptian state. All those technologies for survival, from water jars to copper tools, would be utterly useless if you couldn't navigate the featureless, shifting sea of sand that separated Egypt's oases, mines, and trading partners. Crossing the desert was the ultimate test of their environmental knowledge, a high-stakes game where a single wrong turn meant disappearing forever into the dunes. They couldn't rely on maps or compasses as we know them. Instead, they became masters of reading the ancient, permanent signposts written in the sky above and the earth below, developing a sophisticated art of wayfinding that was part science, part intuition, and entirely essential. This was a skill born from generations of accumulated observation, where a traveler's life depended on their ability to see patterns in a landscape designed to appear utterly chaotic. The most reliable and unchanging guide for any desert traveler, day or night, was the sun. The Egyptians possessed a profound understanding of its daily journey across the sky. They knew that at dawn, it rose in the east, and at dusk, it set in the west, tracing a high arc across the southern sky for those living in the northern hemisphere. This wasn't just casual knowledge, it was a precise tool. By observing the direction and length of their shadow cast by the sun, they could maintain a general sense of direction. A shadow pointing directly west in the late afternoon confirmed they were facing east. For example, this solar navigation was so fundamental it was integrated into their very language and religion. The sun god Ra's daily voyage in his solar bark across the sky was a divine metaphor for their own terrestrial journeys. During the day, the sun was their primary celestial anchor, a blazing beacon whose predictable path provided a constant, if broad, directional framework. However, the sun's utility had its limits, especially during the featureless hours of midday when shadows were at their shortest and direction became ambiguous. For more precise, long-distance navigation, particularly on the multi-week caravan routes, they needed a more stable reference point. This is where their astronomical prowess, honed for creating their calendar, became a matter of life and death after dark. The night sky, far from being a disorienting void, was a detailed and predictable map. Just as the heliacal rising of Sirius signaled the Nile's flood, the consistent positions of other stars provided fixed directional markers. The most important of these were the circumpolar stars, the ones that, from Egypt's latitude, never dipped below the horizon. They rotated around a fixed point in the sky, the North Celestial Pole, very close to our modern Polaris. The Egyptians grouped these imperishable stars into constellations they saw as divine beings. A traveler looking north could always rely on this unchanging, slow-spinning wheel of stars to orient themselves. By memorizing the relationship between these fixed stars and the horizon at different times of the night and year, a skilled navigator could determine not just north, but with careful observation, all four cardinal directions with remarkable accuracy. This celestial knowledge wasn't just theoretical, it was a practical, hands-on tradition passed down through generations of caravan masters and desert scouts known as the Medjay, expert trackers from Nubia who were often employed as the pharaoh's desert police and guide. These men could read the stars as effortlessly as a scribe read hieroglyphs. They knew that as the night progressed, the rising and setting points of certain bright stars on the eastern and western horizons could serve as secondary guides. For instance, the brilliant star Sirius, after its annual reappearance, would be a prominent feature of the winter night sky, and its path could be used as a southern marker. This stellar wayfinding allowed caravans to travel safely through the cool of the night, avoiding the brutal heat of the day. A journey that might have been impossible under the blinding sun became a navigable endeavor under the glittering, orderly dome of the night, turning the stars into a celestial compass that never failed. Yet, the sky was only half the story. The desert floor itself, while seemingly monotonous, was filled with subtle landmarks for those trained to see them. An experienced Medjay scout didn't see a random scatter of sand and rock. He saw a landscape rich with information. Wind, the great sculptor of the desert, creates consistent patterns. Sand dunes, known as barchans, often form in a characteristic crescent shape with their gently sloping backs facing the prevailing wind and their steep, sharp slip faces pointing downwind. By observing the orientation of these dunes, a traveler could gauge the dominant wind direction, which in Egypt was typically from the north, providing another rough directional cue. Rock formations were even more reliable. The relentless sandblasting effect of wind-borne particles over millennia etches distinct patterns into stone. The windward side of a rock outcrop becomes smooth and polished, while the leeward side, protected from the direct abrasive force, remains rougher and may accumulate drifts of sand. By simply running a hand over a lone desert rock, a skilled navigator could feel its history and determine which way the wind consistently blew, reaffirming their sense of north and south. Beyond the shape of individual rocks, the desert's larger geological skeleton provided unmoving signposts. The routes to the western desert oases, for example, were often defined by following the edges of vast limestone plateaus or navigating through distinct mountain passes. A particular, oddly shaped peak on the horizon, visible for days of travel, could serve as a critical waypoint, confirming that the caravan was still on the correct path. The Egyptians also used more deliberate man-made markers. Along well-established routes like the Darb el-Arbain, they would erect cairns, piles of stones, at regular intervals or on high points to mark the trail. In some places, they might even create simple rock alignments on the ground, visible from a distance, that pointed the way to the next water hole or shelter. These physical markers, combined with the celestial map above, created a redundant navigation system. If clouds obscured the stars one night, the shape of the dunes and the location of a known rock outcrop could keep them on course. This multi-layered approach to navigation, combining the permanent stars with the enduring landforms, was the key to their confidence in crossing what appeared to be a trackless waste. It was a testament to their deep, intimate dialogue with their environment, a conversation that allowed them to move through the desert not as lost strangers, but as knowing and respected guests. The relentless desert environment presented a constant onslaught of health challenges, from the blinding glare of the sun to the ever-present threat of dehydration and infection. To combat these ailments, the ancient Egyptians developed one of the world's first sophisticated medical systems, a practice documented in extraordinary detail on papyrus scrolls that have survived for millennia. The most famous of these, the Ebers Papyrus, is a sprawling medical compendium from around 1550 BC that reads like a modern physician's desk reference, containing over 700 remedies and diagnoses for everything from crocodile bites to depression. This wasn't mere folk magic. It was a structured approach to healthcare based on careful observation, trial and error, and a surprisingly advanced understanding of the human body's workings. They saw disease not just as a punishment from the gods, but as a physical condition that could be treated with physical substances, creating a true pharmakon, a healing substance from the very desert that surrounded them. When it came to the harsh realities of desert life, their treatments for heat and dehydration were remarkably pragmatic. They understood the debilitating effects of sunstroke, which they described in terms of a fire in the head, and prescribed a multi-pronged approach to cool the body and restore its fluids. A common remedy involved a cooling poultice made from the crushed leaves and pulp of the aloe vera plant, mixed with cool water or milk and applied directly to the skin. Aloe's natural gel provides a powerful soothing and anti-inflammatory effect, offering immediate relief from scorched skin. For internal cooling and rehydration, they would administer drinks made from water infused with cooling herbs like mint or fenugreek, and crucially, they understood the importance of electrolytes. They would often add a small amount of salt to these hydrating solutions, a primitive but effective way to replenish the salts lost through profuse sweating. For severe heat exhaustion, the Ebers Papyrus even suggests having the patient lie in a cool, darkened room with wet linen cloths draped over them, creating a primitive form of evaporative cooling therapy that directly counteracted the desert's oppressive heat. For the eyes, constantly assailed by sand, dust, and intense glare, the Egyptians had a whole arsenal of treatments beyond the preventative kohl. Eye infections were a common complaint, and their remedies showcase a sophisticated use of local resources. One prescription for conjunctivitis, or pink eye, called for a wash made from an infusion of acacia leaves, which we now know contain tannins with natural astringent and antibacterial properties. Another powerful remedy involved using crushed lapis lazuli or malachite, ground into a fine powder and mixed with breast milk or water to create a soothing eye lotion. The copper salts in the malachite would have provided an antimicrobial effect similar to kohl, fighting the infection directly. For simple irritation and dryness, a drop of castor oil, a known lubricant, was a common treatment. They even had a solution for what they called night blindness, likely a vitamin, a deficiency, prescribing the patient to eat roasted ox liver, an incredibly rich source of that exact vitamin, demonstrating an accidental but profound understanding of the link between diet and specific health condition. The true cornerstone of Egyptian medicine, and perhaps their most versatile healing agent, was honey. They revered it not just as a food or sweetener, but as a primary medicinal substance, using it in an estimated third of all their known remedies. Its application was brilliantly practical. For open wounds and burns, they would apply raw honey directly as a salve, then cover it with a clean linen bandage. Modern science has confirmed the genius of this practice. Honey is hygroscopic, meaning it draws moisture out of bacterial cells, effectively dehydrating and killing them. It is also highly acidic, creating an environment where few bacteria can survive, and it naturally contains low levels of hydrogen peroxide, a known antiseptic. By coating a wound in honey, the Egyptians were creating a sterile, antibacterial barrier that prevented infection and promoted clean healing. They also used honey as a base for many internal medicines, mixing it with herbs to make them more palatable and to soothe sore throats and cough. It was their all-purpose antibiotic, a natural substance whose healing power was unlocked through meticulous observation. Beyond honey, their herbal repertoire was vast and deeply informed by their environment. Garlic was a staple, fed to the laborers building the pyramids to increase strength and ward off infections. We now know its allicin content has potent antibacterial and antiparasitic properties. They used thyme for its antiseptic qualities in wound cleaning, and cumin and coriander as carminatives to soothe digestive troubles, which were common in a diet that could be unreliable. Willow bark was used as a treatment for pain and inflammation. It contained salicin, which is the natural precursor to modern aspirin. Perhaps one of their most insightful practices was the use of yeast from beer brewing. The Ebers Papyrus recommends applying a poultice of fermented yeast or moldy bread to septic wounds. While they wouldn't have understood the concept of penicillin, they were empirically harnessing the antibiotic properties of certain molds to fight infection, a practice that would not be rediscovered in the West for another 3,000 years. This systematic exploration of their botanical world shows a culture dedicated to finding solutions in nature, building a sophisticated materia medica that was both effective and deeply integrated into their daily struggle for health in a challenging land. Nowhere is the Egyptian mastery of dehydration and preservation more strikingly demonstrated than in their most iconic and profound practice, mummification. While we often view it through a lens of spirituality and the quest for eternity, at its core, it was an incredible feat of applied desert science. This wasn't magic. It was a systematic, chemical process born directly from their everyday struggle to survive in a dry climate. They took the principles they used to preserve fish with salt and invented a technology to preserve the human body itself, scaling up their practical knowledge into the ultimate act of preparation for the afterlife. The arid desert wasn't just a burial ground. It provided the very tools for the transformation, with the most crucial ingredient being a remarkable substance harvested from its dry lake beds, natron. This natron salt was the cornerstone of the entire mummification ritual, and its properties were perfectly suited to the task. Found in abundance in places like the Wadi Natron, northwest of Memphis, natron is a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, sodium chloride, and sodium sulfate. To the Egyptian embalmers, this white, powdery substance was a divine gift. Its power lay in its dual action as a superb desiccant and a mild antiseptic. As a desiccant, it was brutally effective. When packed around a body, it aggressively pulled moisture out of the tissues through osmosis, rapidly dehydrating the skin, muscles, and organs. This removal of water was the single most important step, because moisture is the fundamental requirement for bacterial growth and decay. By creating an utterly dry environment, natron halted decomposition in its tracks. Simultaneously, its alkaline, soapy nature helped to dissolve fatty tissues and saponify them, essentially turning them into a kind of soap, which further cleansed the body and aided in preservation. They understood that to cheat decay, they had to win the battle against water, and natron was their ultimate weapon. The mummification procedure itself reads like a precise, if grisly, technical manual, a 70-day-long operation that methodically applied this understanding. First, the embalmers would remove the internal organs, the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines through a small incision in the left side. These organs, being particularly prone to rapid decomposition, were processed separately. Each was carefully dried with natron, anointed with oils, wrapped in linen, and placed into their own special jars, the canopic jars, for safekeeping. The brain, seen as unimportant, was typically broken up and extracted through the nostrils using long, hook-like bronze tools. Then came the central, transformative stage, dehydration. The body cavity was rinsed with palm wine, a natural antiseptic, and then packed full with small linen bags of natron. The entire body was then completely covered in a massive mound of loose natron salt. It was left in this dry, natron-filled bed for 40 days, a period carefully calculated to achieve total desiccation without causing the brittle, leathery skin to crack. After this 40-day period, the body was utterly changed. It was no longer a perishable object, but a stable, permanent form. The embalmers would remove the now moisture-laden natron packs from the body, which would have lost over 75% of its original weight, leaving behind a very light, shrunken, but perfectly preserved shell. The skin was dark, tight, and fragile. To restore a more lifelike appearance, the embalmers would often pack the sunken cavities of the body with clean linen, sawdust, or even mud to fill out the contour. They might add false eyes, and sometimes perfumed, resin-soaked linen packs were placed under the skin to improve the form. Then, the meticulous wrapping would begin. Each finger and toe was individually wrapped before the limbs and entire body were swaddled in hundreds of yards of fine linen strips. As they wrapped, priests recited spells and amulets were inserted between the layers, a scarab over the heart, golden cobras on the forehead, each serving a spiritual purpose. But the physical integrity was already secured by the chemical power of the natron. This entire practice is a direct, breathtaking extension of their survival technology. The Egyptians lived in a world where they preserved fish with salt from the same desert to feed the laborers building the pyramids. They observed that a body left in the hot, dry sand would naturally desiccate and be preserved. Mummification was the intentional, amplified version of this natural phenomenon. They replaced the passive heat of the sun with the active, aggressive drying power of natron. They replaced the chance elements of the desert with a controlled, ritualized environment. The connection is undeniable. The same knowledge of salts and dehydration that ensured their physical survival in the desert was leveraged to ensure their spiritual survival in the afterlife. It represents the pinnacle of their environmental adaptation, taking a harsh, destructive force like the arid climate and learning to wield its power for their own profound purposes, turning the very agent of death in the desert into the guarantor of eternal life. But in a culture so focused on practicality and survival, where did something as seemingly frivolous as makeup and perfume fit in? The answer might surprise you, because for the ancient Egyptians, these were not mere indulgences. They were essential tools for health, hygiene, and social harmony in an unforgiving climate. Imagine the constant assault on the skin from the desert environment, blistering sun, relentless wind, and an atmosphere so dry it could chap and crack exposed flesh in a matter of hours. This is where their legendary use of scented oils and unguents reveals its deeply practical core. Everyone, from the highest official to the most humble farmer, would anoint their skin daily with these concoctions. They were the ancient world's equivalent of therapeutic moisturizer and sunscreen rolled into one. The primary base for these unguents was typically animal fat or plant oils, like castor oil or linseed oil, which were prized for their emollient properties. These oils created a protective, occlusive barrier on the skin, sealing in precious moisture and preventing the dry, desert air from wicking it away, thus preventing the painful cracking and irritation that could lead to open sores and infection. These weren't just simple greases, however. The Egyptians were masters of aromatherapy and medicinal infusion. They would steep these oil bases with fragrant resins and herbs known for their healing properties. Myrrh, a resin imported from the land of Punt, was a particular favorite. Modern studies have shown that myrrh possesses powerful anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial qualities, making it an ideal additive for soothing sun-scorched or wind-burned skin. Frankincense, another prized resin, was also believed to have antiseptic properties. They might also infuse their oils with soothing aloe vera or the extract of the blue lotus flower, which was thought to have both a pleasing scent and skin-softening benefits. By applying these medicated unguents, they were actively treating their largest organ, combating the environmental damage they faced every time they stepped outside. For a laborer working on a sun-baked construction site, this daily ritual was as crucial for preventing debilitating skin conditions as it was for a noble preparing for a temple ceremony. The act of anointing the body was a form of preventative medicine, a direct response to the physiological challenges of their world. Then there was the matter of scent itself, which served a function that feels almost modern in its social awareness. In a hot climate without the convenience of daily showers or modern deodorants, body odor was an unavoidable reality. But for the Egyptians, who placed an immense cultural value on ritual purity and cleanliness, being physically clean was intertwined with being spiritually clean. The strong, lingering fragrances of heavy perfumes were the most effective tool available to manage this. They developed sophisticated solid perfumes made by blending fragrant oils with a waxy base, which would melt against the warmth of the skin and release their scent gradually throughout the day. A nobleman attending a state function or a priest performing a sacred rite would be enveloped in a cloud of lotus, lily, or cinnamon, effectively masking any natural odors and projecting an aura of refinement and divine favor. This connection between scent and sanctity was profound. The gods themselves were believed to be pleased by sweet smells, and temple rituals involved the burning of vast quantities of incense pellets of myrrh and frankincense, whose smoke was seen as a physical bridge to the divine. To approach a god while carrying the smells of the mundane world was considered impure. Therefore, the use of perfume was not vanity, it was a form of respect, a necessary step in preparing oneself to interact with both the divine and human social spheres. The famous scene of Queen Cleopatra having the sails of her barge soaked in perfume so that Mark Antony would smell her arrival before he saw her was not just a dramatic flourish. It was the ultimate expression of a deeply ingrained cultural logic where scent defined presence, power, and purity. In the close quarters of a crowded marketplace or the hushed halls of a palace, a pleasant fragrance signified that a person was in a state of physical and ritual cleanliness, making perfume an indispensable part of the social contract. After mastering the large-scale movement of water, the Egyptians turned their attention to a final, critical refinement in ensuring what they drank, and ate was free from the countless impurities that the river and the desert air carried with them. This is where one of their most elegantly simple yet profoundly impactful technologies comes into play, the sieve. In a world without synthetic filter cartridges or fine metal mesh, they engineered these essential tools from the most basic materials available, transforming coarse, potentially hazardous substances into clean, safer sources. A sieve, in its most fundamental form, is nothing more than a mesh screen, but in the hands of the Egyptians, it became a first line of defense for public health, a humble guardian that operated at the intersection of the kitchen and the canal bank. The need for such a tool becomes starkly clear when you consider the reality of their primary water source. While the Nile was their lifeline, it was far from a pristine, bottled spring. The same life-giving silt that fertilized their fields also clouded the water with fine, suspended particles. Canals and irrigation ditches, while brilliant for agriculture, were open to the environment, collecting blown sand, organic debris, and all manner of microscopic sediment. Drinking this water directly meant ingesting a gritty, unpalatable mixture that could irritate the digestive tract and potentially harbor harmful parasites or bacteria. The solution was as straightforward as it was effective. Using the reeds and grasses that grew in abundance along the riverbanks, Egyptian artisans would weave a tight mesh, often creating a shallow, basket-like form. To use it, a person would simply pour water from a jar or directly scoop water from a canal through this woven screen. The mesh acted as a physical barrier, trapping the larger suspended particles, the silt, the sand, the bits of plant matter, allowing visibly clear water to pass through into a waiting vessel below. This act of filtration, repeated millions of times daily across the kingdom, had a cumulative impact on health and comfort that is difficult to overstate. While it wouldn't remove dissolved contaminants or microscopic pathogens as a modern filter does, it performed a crucial primary cleaning. By removing the visible grit and sediment, the sieve made the water far more pleasant to drink and cook with. More importantly, it eliminated a significant source of physical irritation to the throat and gut. Chronic consumption of abrasive particles can cause micro tears in the intestinal lining, creating points of entry for infection. By straining out this grit, the sieve reduced this risk, contributing to better overall digestive health for the population. It was a low-tech, decentralized form of water treatment that every household could implement, a small but vital step in a chain of survival that turned murky river water into a potable, life-sustaining liquid. The very same principle of separation was applied with equal importance in their kitchens, specifically in the preparation of their most vital staple food, bread. The journey from emmer wheat or barley to flour was a dusty, labor-intensive process. Grain was typically ground on a heavy stone quern, a saddle-shaped grinding stone, using a smaller handstone called a mano. This process, while effective at breaking down the kernels, inevitably pulverized small bits of the stone grinder itself, mixing minute stone grit into the flour. Furthermore, the harvested grain always contained tiny husks, bits of chaff, and the ever-present desert sand that had clung to it during harvesting and threshing. If this coarse, gritty flour was used directly to make dough, the resulting bread would be unpleasantly abrasive to eat and over time would cause significant tooth wear, a condition clearly visible on the remains of ancient Egyptians who lacked access to finely sifted flour. To combat this, the Egyptian baker or housewife employed a food sieve, often a finer version of the water strainer. They would take the roughly ground flour and shake or rub it through this tightly woven mesh. The finer, desirable flour particles would fall through, while the larger, unwanted elements, the sharp stone grit, the tough husks, the sand, would be caught in the sieve and discarded. The difference this made to their daily diet was monumental. Bread made from sifted flour was not only smoother and more palatable, but it was also significantly less damaging to their teeth. This simple, repetitive act of sifting was a direct investment in long-term health and quality of life. It transformed a necessary, potentially harmful staple into a safer, more enjoyable food, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of preventative care through food preparation. The sieve, in this context, was as much a medical tool as a culinary one, protecting the populace from the slow, grinding toll of their own daily bread. Now, having mastered the art of staying cool and hydrated, we turn to a technology that brought comfort and safety to the other half of the Egyptian day, the profound chill of the desert night. When the sun vanished, the temperature could plummet dramatically, transforming the searing landscape into a place of biting cold. In this shift from one extreme to another, a different kind of mastery was required, one centered on a single, flickering, life-giving element, fire. For the ancient Egyptians, creating and controlling fire was not a casual convenience. It was a vital defense against the darkness, a source of essential warmth, and a formidable tool for turning the hostile night into a place of community, craft, and security. Their methods for summoning this power were as ingenious as their other adaptations, relying on friction, precision, and a deep understanding of materials readily available in their environment. The most advanced and reliable technology for conjuring a flame from nothing was the bow drill, a device that transformed sustained, rhythmic effort into intense, focused heat. Imagine a craftsman or a soldier on campaign, kneeling with a set of simple wooden components. The core of the system was the hearthboard, a flat piece of dry, soft wood acacia or tamarisk were ideal, into which a small, shallow depression had been carved. Resting in this depression was the spindle, a straight, smooth rod of a harder wood, like cedar if available, tapered at both ends. The top of the spindle was capped with a handhold, often just a stone or a piece of hardwood with a carved socket, lubricated with a little animal fat to reduce friction. The true genius, however, was the bow. This was a curved piece of wood, about the length of a man's forearm, with a loose string, perhaps made of sinew or a tough leather thong, tied to each end. The craftsman would loop this bowstring once around the spindle, place the spindle's point into the depression on the hearthboard, and then, while applying steady downward pressure with the handhold, he would saw the bow back and forth with a smooth and rapid motion. The physics at play were beautiful in their efficiency. The bow's motion was converted into a rapid rotation of the spindle, its tip grinding against the softer wood of the hearthboard. This relentless friction generated intense heat through mechanical energy, creating a fine, black powdered dust that would collect in a small notch carved into the edge of the depression. As the dust grew hotter and hotter, its temperature would soar past 800 degrees Fahrenheit, and the particles would begin to smolder, forming a tiny, glowing ember. This was the moment of creation, a man-made coal, birthed from pure motion and pressure. With the utmost care, the craftsman would then tip this precious ember into a waiting tinder bundle, a small nest of perfectly prepared, ultra-dry, and finely shredded materials. He might use dried grass, the fluffy down from cattails, or charred cloth, anything that would catch from the smallest spark. By gently blowing on the bundle, cradling it in his hands, he would nurse the ember into a tiny flame, which would then be transferred to a larger fire. This was not a quick process. It required practice, patience, and a deep, intuitive feel for the materials. A skilled user could produce fire in under a minute, but mastering the bow drill was an art form, a testament to their ability to manipulate the physical world to meet their most fundamental needs. For more immediate, though less reliable, ignition, they also utilized the spark, producing power of flint and iron pyrite. Flint, a hard, sharp-edged stone abundant in the limestone cliffs bordering the Nile Valley, was a staple of their toolkit for many purposes. When struck sharply against a nodule of iron pyrite, a brassy, metallic mineral often called fool's gold, the collision would shave off tiny, superheated slivers of the pyrite. These minuscule particles, burning as they flew through the air, became a shower of brilliant sparks. To catch these fleeting points of heat, the Egyptians again relied on a carefully prepared tinder. A common and highly effective method was to use a piece of amadou, a tinder made from the hoof fungus that grows on trees, or a charred piece of linen cloth. The charring process made the material incredibly combustible, so that when a spark landed on its porous, black surface, it would readily take hold and begin to glow. The user would then transfer this nascent ember to their tinder bundle, blowing it gently into a flame just as with the bow drill. While the flint and pyrite method was faster to initiate, it was highly dependent on the quality of the stones, the sharpness of the strike, and the readiness of the tinder. It was perhaps better suited for a soldier or a traveler who needed to attempt a quick fire without the full setup of the bow drill, a more portable but less guaranteed solution for creating life in the cold desert night. Once that initial flame was coaxed into existence, its role expanded far beyond the simple act of ignition. The primary and most obvious use was for warmth. The temperature difference between day and night in the eastern desert can be extreme, a swing of 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit that could be dangerous for anyone exposed without shelter. A well-built fire became the heart of the camp, a portable sun that pushed back the chill. For the workmen at a remote quarry, for soldiers on patrol, or for a family in a modest village home during the winter months, gathering around the fire was a daily ritual of survival and socialization. The heat radiating from the flames and the glowing bed of coals provided direct, comforting warmth, warding off hypothermia and making sleep possible. The fire's heat also had a practical application in modifying their immediate microclimate. In a simple desert shelter, a small, contained fire could take the bitter edge off the interior air, making a mud brick room habitable through the long, cold nights. This mastery of personal climate control, extending from their architecturally cooled days to their fire-warmed nights, shows a comprehensive understanding of how to manage their environment across its entire cycle. Of course, fire was also the engine of their cuisine, transforming raw ingredients into safe, digestible, and flavorful food. While we've discussed their preservation techniques, fire was the final step in the culinary process. Cooking over an open flame or in clay ovens did more than just make food tastier. It was a critical line of defense against disease. The heat destroyed harmful bacteria and parasites present in meat and fish, significantly reducing the risk of foodborne illness that could devastate a community. Baking bread in a hot, preheated clay oven or on the hot stones surrounding a fire gelatinized the starches in the grain, making the nutrients more bioavailable and easier for the body to absorb. The shared act of cooking and eating around a fire also reinforced social bonds. The evening meal, prepared in a communal cooking area or over a household hearth, was a time for storytelling, for sharing the day's events, and for strengthening the family and community ties that were the bedrock of Egyptian society. The flickering light of the cooking fire illuminated not just the food, but the very faces of their culture, creating a circle of warmth and connection in the vast, dark expanse. Beyond heat and food, fire provided a second, equally vital commodity: light. In a world without electricity, the fall of night brought near total blackness, especially in the deep desert, far from any settlement. A simple oil lamp, a dish of clay or stone filled with castor or linseed oil with a linen wick, could push back the shadows in a small room, but a roaring campfire illuminated a much larger area, its dancing flames throwing light dozens of feet into surrounding darkness. This illumination was a powerful tool for extending the productive day. Artisans could continue their work, repairing tools or crafting small items by the firelight. Guards on duty could maintain their vigilance, their night vision preserved by the fire, while also being able to see any movement in the immediate vicinity. For a desert caravan, a ring of fires around the campsite created a well-lit perimeter, a clear boundary between the safe human space and the unknown dangers of the night. This ability to artificially extend the day granted them a measure of control over time itself, refusing to let the sun's absence bring all activity to a complete halt. This leads us to the fire's final critical function: protection. The Egyptian desert was not empty after dark. It was home to predators that saw the night as their domain: scorpions, venomous snakes like the horned viper, and larger hunters like striped hyenas, jackals, and even leopards that might venture close to a campsite attracted by the smell of food or livestock. A burning fire was a formidable psychological and physical barrier against these creatures. Most animals possess a deep-seated instinctive fear of flame and smoke, and they will generally avoid a brightly lit, smoky area. The crackling sounds and unpredictable movements of the fire created an aura of activity that deterred all but the most desperate predators from approaching. For the shepherds watching over flocks on the desert's edge, a night fire was an essential part of their watch, helping to keep the sheep and goats calm and safe from prowling jackals. For a lone traveler or a small group, the fire was a companion and a guardian, its light offering the confidence that they were not entirely at the mercy of the wild. In this role, fire completed its cycle of utility. It was a creator of comfort, a tool for sustenance, an extender of time, and finally, a steadfast guardian standing watch against the perils that lurked just beyond the circle of its warm, reassuring glow. All the technology in the world, however, means very little if the human spirit cannot endure the psychological toll of a landscape that is both breathtakingly beautiful and deeply hostile. Living constantly on the edge of a vast, arid wilderness where a single failed harvest or an unexpected sandstorm could spell disaster created an underlying current of anxiety. The very universe could feel chaotic and unpredictable. In response, the ancient Egyptians developed a profound and resilient psychological framework, a mental fortress built on the bedrock of a single, all-encompassing concept: man. This was not just a philosophical idea, it was the fundamental principle of cosmic order, truth, and justice that they believed was woven into the very fabric of existence. Imagine man as the divine blueprint for how the universe should function: the sun rising each morning, the Nile flooding each year, the seasons turning in their proper order. It represented harmony, balance, and the ultimate triumph of order over chaos. For the Egyptian mind, the brutal, unpredictable desert was the physical manifestation of its opposite: isfet, or chaos, disorder, and falsehood. The desert was the realm of the god Set, the force of storms, violence, and confusion. Their entire civilization, therefore, became a monumental act of imposing Maat upon the chaos of the Red Land. Every time they built a perfectly symmetrical pyramid, every time they successfully predicted the inundation using their calendar, every time a pharaoh upheld justice in a court of law, they were not just performing a practical act. They were participating in a cosmic ritual, actively reinforcing the divine order of the universe, and pushing back the ever-present threat of entropy and collapse that the desert so vividly represented. This belief in a structured cosmos was personified and made accessible through their vast and intricate pantheon of gods. These deities were not distant, abstract figures. They were intimately connected to the very forces the Egyptians needed to understand and appease to survive. The sun god Ra, for instance, was not merely a symbol of the sun. He was the sun, embarking on a perilous journey each night through the underworld, battling the serpent of chaos, Apep, so that he could be reborn at dawn. For an Egyptian, the sunrise was not a guaranteed astronomical event. It was a daily victory of order over chaos, a miracle that required their collective faith and ritual support to ensure it happened again. Similarly, the god Osiris embodied the regenerative power of nature and the Nile itself. His myth being murdered and dismembered by his brother Set, then resurrected by his wife Isis to become the lord of the afterlife, directly mirrored the agricultural cycle. The Nile's life-giving floodwaters receded each year, leaving the land seemingly dead and barren, only for it to burst back into life with the next inundation. Osiris offered a divine narrative that made sense of this cycle, transforming it from a random environmental occurrence into a sacred story of death and rebirth. This provided immense psychological comfort. A bad flood or a drought was not a meaningless catastrophe. It could be understood within this divine framework, perhaps as a sign that Maat was out of balance and needed to be restored through greater piety and correct action. The gods provided a language to explain the unexplainable and a system through which humans could actively participate in maintaining the stability of their world. Rituals, both grand and personal, were the practical tools for this participation. On a state level, the pharaoh served as the chief priest of Egypt, the sole intermediary between the people and the gods. It was his sacred duty to perform the daily rituals in the temples that sustained Maat. These were not empty ceremonies. In the Egyptian world, if the pharaoh failed in his duties, the gods might withdraw their favor, causing the Nile to fail, the sun to vanish, and chaos to reign. The monumental temples, with their secluded, dark sanctuaries, were not public places of worship, but powerful machines for maintaining cosmic order. The care and feeding of the god's statue, washing, clothing, and offering food, was believed to nourish the deity's spirit, ensuring they remained strong enough to keep the universe running smoothly. This state-sponsored religion provided a collective sense of security, a belief that someone at the highest level was actively ensuring the sun would rise and the river would flow. For the average person, this psychological framework was reinforced through personal piety and household worship. While they might not enter the inner sanctum of a great temple, they had their own household shrines where they could appeal to more accessible deities. They prayed to Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess, for protection during childbirth. They left offerings at the local shrine to Bes, the dwarf god, to ward off evil spirits and dangerous creatures of the night. They believed in the protective power of amulets, the Eye of Horus for health, the scarab beetle for regeneration, wearing them as physical, tangible manifestations of divine protection on their bodies. This personal connection to the divine created a powerful buffer against the fear and uncertainty of daily life. If a child fell ill, it wasn't just bad luck. It was the work of a demon or a displeased spirit, and there were rituals, spells, and amulets that could be used to set things right. This sense of agency, of being able to influence their fate through correct action and prayer, was a crucial coping mechanism. It transformed a world that could feel random and terrifying into one that was ultimately intelligible and manageable through the proper relationship with the divine. This spiritual world reached its ultimate expression in their preparations for the afterlife, which were essentially the final and most important act of survival. The desert, which was the embodiment of chaos in life, became the gateway to eternal order in death. The arid sands that naturally preserved bodies showed them that death was not an end, but a transformation. The entire mummification process was a ritual reenactment of the myth of Osiris, designed to ensure the deceased would be successfully reborn in the next world. The Book of the Dead, placed in the tomb, was not a book of dogma, but a practical guidebook, a collection of spells and maps to help the soul navigate the treacherous landscape of the underworld, overcome demons, and pass the final judgment. This judgment was the ultimate test of Maat. The deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of Maat. If the heart was heavy with sin and outweighed the feather, it was devoured by a monster, and the soul ceased to exist. But if it was in balance, the soul would be welcomed into the field of reeds, a perfect, idealized version of Egypt, where the crops were always plentiful and the Nile always flowed. This belief system provided the ultimate psychological solace. The harshness of the desert and the struggles of life were not the final word. There was a perfect, orderly world waiting beyond, a world that could be earned by living a life in harmony with Maat. This conviction gave them the courage to face the immense challenges of their environment, not with despair, but with the profound hope that their actions in this chaotic world were building a foundation for an eternity of perfect, unshakable order. Yet for all their ingenuity in surviving within the Nile Valley, there remained an undeniable and fundamental reality. Their land was rich in food and sun-baked mud, but desperately poor in other materials essential for building a great civilization. Imagine possessing the architectural vision to build a pyramid, but lacking the durable wood to make the sledges and levers to move the stones. Envision the desire to project royal power, but having no native source of the gold to craft a divine crown. This was the paradox of Egypt, a land of agricultural abundance built upon a foundation of material scarcity. The very things that would allow their society to reach its zenith, long, straight timber for ships and monuments, copper and tin for hard tools and weapons, silver and gold for religious and political expression, simply did not exist within their natural order. This inherent scarcity became the unlikely engine that drove them to look outward, transforming them from a self-contained river culture into the central hub of an international network of trade and diplomacy that stretched for thousands of miles across some of the most formidable terrain on Earth. This was not trade for mere luxury, it was trade for survival and supremacy. The most glaring deficiency was wood. The native acacia and sycamore fig trees of Egypt were short, knotty, and crooked, useful for ceiling beams in small homes or for crafting everyday objects, but utterly inadequate for the grand projects of the state. To build the massive, seagoing ships that could travel the Levant for more trade, or to construct the enormous barges needed to transport 200-ton obelisks, they needed long, straight, and durable timber. The answer lay in the famed cedar forests of Lebanon. Cedar wood was a miracle material for the Egyptians. It was strong, resistant to rot, and incredibly fragrant. It was also phenomenally expensive and difficult to acquire. Sending an Egyptian expedition to the port of Byblos was a monumental undertaking, a state-sponsored endeavor on par with the military campaign. These were not simple merchant voyages, they were diplomatic missions, led by high-ranking officials who bore gifts from the pharaoh to the local ruler precious gold, linen, and papyrus to secure permission to cut the trees and ensure safe passage. The Egyptians became so reliant on the port of Byblos for this essential resource that their word for ship, kebanet, was derived from the name Byblos, and the term Byblos ship became synonymous with a large ocean-going vessel. Their entire maritime capability, and thus their ability to engage in long-distance trade, was fundamentally built upon this imported lumber. While wood was the backbone of their ambition, metal was the sharp edge of their power. The Nile Valley held some copper deposits in the eastern desert and the Sinai, but these were quickly exhausted by the insatiable demands of the Pyramid Age. For a steady and abundant supply of copper, and for the even more crucial tin required to make the harder bronze alloy, Egypt had to turn to its neighbors. The turquoise and copper mines of the Sinai became a crucible of Egyptian colonialism, with the state establishing permanent, fortified settlements like the one at Sarabat el-Khadim to protect the miners and manage the flow of metal back to the homeland. But the ultimate prize was gold, the flesh of the gods, which held both economic and profound religious significance. The primary source for this incorruptible metal was Nubia, the land to the south, a region the Egyptians came to call the land of the bow for its skilled archer warriors. Securing this golden treasure required more than just trade. It demanded a mixture of brutal military force and shrewd political control. The Egyptians built a series of massive mud brick fortresses along the Nile in lower Nubia, like the ones at Buhin and Semna. These were not just military garrisons. They were combination customs posts, trading centers, and symbols of pharaonic power, designed to control the river traffic, impose taxes on any goods moving north, and launch punitive raids deep into Nubian territory when the flow of gold was threatened. This relationship was a clear example of economic scarcity dictating foreign policy, turning a neighboring culture into a subjugated resource colony. To acquire the goods that couldn't be taken by force, the Egyptians mastered the art of soft power and diplomacy, establishing a system of gift exchange with other great powers that functioned as a form of international trade. The Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets from the 14th century BC written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the day, reveal a world of kings addressing each other as brother. In these letters, the pharaohs of Egypt and the rulers of empires like the Hittites, Mitanni, and Babylon engage in a delicate dance of request and reciprocity. A typical letter might begin with lavish professions of friendship before getting to the point. A request for shipments of lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, a rare and dazzling blue stone highly prized for jewelry and inlay, in exchange for a shipment of Egyptian gold. This was not a modern commercial transaction with negotiated prices, but a carefully choreographed exchange of royal gifts that served to cement political alliances, demonstrate wealth and generosity, and maintain a balance of power. The goods that moved through this diplomatic network, silver from Anatolia, fine oils from Cyprus, horses and chariots from the Near East, were as much political symbols as they were commodities, weaving Egypt into a web of international relations that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Iranian plateau. The ultimate expression of this long-distance trade, and the greatest logistical achievement of Egyptian commerce, was the expedition to the land of Punt. The exact location of Punt is still debated, but it was likely situated along the Red Sea coast in modern-day Sudan, Eritrea, or Somalia. A voyage to Punt was the ancient equivalent of a mission to the moon, a legendary journey to a semi-mythical land that required years of planning and immense state resources. The most famous account, depicted on the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri, shows a fleet of 5 large seagoing ships, each powered by sail and oars. The logistical challenge was immense. Since the Nile and the Red Sea are not connected by a navigable waterway, the Egyptians had to build these ships on the Nile, then disassemble them and transport the pieces, along with supplies and sailors, across the harsh eastern desert via the Wadi Hammamat to a Red Sea port, where the vessels were painstakingly reassembled for the open water voyage. The risks were enormous, but the rewards were deemed worth any price. From Punt, they returned with treasures that were utterly unique to that land, laid frankincense and myrrh trees with their root balls carefully packed in baskets for replanting in Egypt, massive quantities of fragrant resin, precious ebony wood, ivory tusks, and exotic animal skin. These goods, especially the incense, were not merely luxuries. They were the lifeblood of state religion, essential for the daily temple rituals that maintained cosmic order. The success of a Punt expedition was a defining measure of a pharaoh's power, proving they could command the resources and loyalty to reach the ends of the earth and bring back its divine bounty. Through these daring ventures, the Egyptians transformed their material scarcity into a strategic advantage, building an economic empire that ensured the flow of essential resources into the Nile Valley for 3,000 years. Of course, this mastery of the desert environment and its trade routes would have been impossible without the strength to defend it. A civilization as wealthy and resource-rich as Egypt was a constant beacon to the hungry eyes of neighboring tribes and rival empires. To protect their lifeline, the ancient Egyptians evolved from a land of farmers into a formidable military power, developing a specialized arsenal and a strategy of defense that was perfectly tailored to the vast open landscapes they called home. Their military technology wasn't just about having the biggest army, it was about strategic mobility, psychological dominance, and controlling the barren ground itself. The ultimate symbol of this new form of desert warfare was the chariot. Think of it not as a tank, but as the ancient world's equivalent of a fast attack vehicle or a mobile weapons platform. Introduced around the time of the Hyksos in the Second Intermediate Period, the Egyptians didn't just adopt this technology, they perfected it for their specific needs. An Egyptian war chariot was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. Its frame was crafted from bent wood, often the prized imported cedar, creating a structure that was incredibly light and resilient. The platform was just large enough for two men, a driver who controlled the pair of magnificent, specially bred horses, and a warrior who was free to wield a composite bow, throw javelins, or command. The key to its devastating effectiveness was its weight. A single soldier could lift one, allowing for rapid deployment and retrieval from a transport ship. The wheels were a particular focus of innovation, with 4 spokes in earlier models evolving to 6, which provided the perfect balance of strength and minimal weight for speed. On the battlefield, the chariot's role was one of shock, terror, and tactical superiority. In the flat, hard-packed terrain of the desert fringes or the broad Nile Delta, a squadron of these vehicles could cover ground at an astonishing pace, something foot soldiers could never hope to match. A common tactic was for the chariots to race along the enemy's flanks, with the warrior unleashing a relentless hail of arrows. The composite bow, itself a technological marvel made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, had a much greater range and penetrating power than a simple self-bow. From the unstable, bouncing platform of a chariot, hitting a target was incredibly difficult, which is why the warriors who manned them were among the military elite, trained from a young age. The psychological impact of a thundering line of chariots, with their glinting gold decorations, polished wood, and the cloud of dust they kicked up, was often enough to break an enemy's formation before the main infantry even engaged. They could shatter a line, run down fleeing soldiers, and provide a mobile command post for generals, all while being fast enough to disengage from a losing fight. The chariot turned the empty desert from a defensive liability into an offensive asset, a wide open plain where Egyptian speed and technology could reign supreme. But speed alone couldn't secure a border that stretched for hundreds of miles through some of the most desolate terrain on Earth. For that, the Egyptians employed a strategy of static, overwhelming force, building some of the most impressive fortifications the ancient world had ever seen. Nowhere is this more evident than in the string of massive mud brick fortresses built in Nubia and the Sinai. These weren't simple watchtowers. They were sprawling, geometrically complex military bases designed to project power and control the flow of people and goods. Take the fortress at Buhan in Nubia, for example. It was a veritable walled city with towering, sloping ramparts surrounded by a deep, rock-cut ditch. The walls themselves were punctuated with bastions projecting structures that allowed defenders to fire along the length of the wall, eliminating blind spots. The gateways were elaborate death traps, often featuring multiple right-angle turns and elevated kill zones where defenders could rain down arrows and stones on any attacker who managed to breach the outer door. The strategic placement of these forts reveals a profound understanding of desert geography. In Nubia, they were built along the narrow, fertile strip of the Nile, effectively creating a wall of fortresses that controlled the only viable north-south route. Any army or trading caravan heading to or from the gold-rich lands of the south had to pass under the watchful eyes of the Egyptian garrison. In the Sinai, the forts guarded the vital copper and turquoise mining regions and the roads that led to the Levant. They secured the water sources, the single most critical asset in the desert. By controlling the wells and oases, the Egyptian military didn't just protect their own mining operations, they held the power of life and death over any other group wishing to cross the peninsula. A potential invader would have to either capture a heavily fortified position with a permanent garrison or face a lethal, waterless march through the desert. This network of forts functioned as a massive territorial customs and border police force. ensuring that the priceless resources of Nubian gold and Sinai copper flowed steadily north into Egypt, while simultaneously preventing unauthorized incursions. They were the unblinking, immovable guardians of the empire's economic arteries. Beyond the grand strategy of chariots and fortresses, the individual soldier's kit was also adapted for the harsh realities of desert combat. While the elite charioteers used the composite bow, the core infantry was equipped with a variety of weapons designed for different tactical situations. The most common foot soldier carried a simple yet effective arsenal: a spear for thrusting in close formation, a bronze battle axe for hacking through enemy shields and limbs, and a dagger for the brutal work of close-quarters combat. For protection, they carried large shields made from wooden frames covered in tough bovine hide. These were not the heavy bronze shields of some Mediterranean armies. They were lightweight and resilient, perfect for soldiers who might have to march for days under the hot sun. Body armor was relatively rare for the common soldier, but officers and elite troops might wear corselets made of leather scales or, in later periods, overlapping bronze plates, providing flexibility and protection without being completely debilitating in the heat. Perhaps one of the most iconic weapons wielded by the elite shock troops, known as the Naktua, or the strong arm, was the khopesh. This was a uniquely Egyptian weapon, a curved sword that looked like a hybrid between a battle axe and a sickle. Its distinctive shape was brutally functional. The curved, heavy blade concentrated the force of a swing onto a small area, allowing it to smash through an enemy's shield or parry with devastating effect. The inside of the curve could be used to hook an opponent's shield or limb, pulling them off balance and leaving them exposed to a killing blow from a companion. The design was so effective that it was adopted and adapted by other cultures throughout the Near East. For desert warfare, where engagements could quickly devolve into chaotic melees, the khopesh was a close-range weapon of terror. The sight of these elite troops, their khopesh blades gleaming, advancing behind a wall of shields, was the final, crushing element of the Egyptian military machine, the anvil to the chariot's hammer. From the strategic speed of the chariot corps to the unyielding stone of the border fortresses and the brutal efficiency of the infantry's weapons, every aspect of Egyptian military technology was a calculated response to the challenges of their world, ensuring that the Black Land of the Nile remained protected by the fierce, organized might of the Red Land. It's truly remarkable how the survival strategies born on the banks of the Nile thousands of years ago have echoes that resonate powerfully in our modern world. The fundamental challenges of the desert haven't changed. The sun still beats down with brutal intensity, and water remains the ultimate currency of life. What has evolved is our technology, yet the core principles of ancient Egyptian ingenuity are often the very same ones guiding cutting-edge design today. Consider their architectural genius. The ancient Egyptians didn't have electricity for air conditioning, so they mastered passive cooling, using thick mud brick walls with high thermal mass to absorb heat during the day and release it at night, alongside strategically placed high windows for natural ventilation. Fast forward to the 21st century, and you'll find contemporary architects in arid regions championing these exact same principles under the banner of sustainable or bioclimatic design. Modern buildings in places like Arizona or the United Arab Emirates often feature massive, insulated walls, just like those ancient mud brick homes, to slow the transfer of heat. They utilize strategically placed thermal chimneys that harness the fact that hot air rises, creating a natural airflow that pulls cooler air through the building without a single watt of electricity, a sophisticated version of the simple cross ventilation an Egyptian homeowner would have used. The central courtyard with the water feature, a staple of Egyptian domestic architecture designed to cool incoming breezes, finds its direct descendant in the evaporative cooling towers and shaded atrium spaces of modern eco-friendly resorts and homes, proving that sometimes the most advanced solution is a timeless one. Their intuitive understanding of personal cooling through clothing is another area where ancient wisdom foreshadowed modern science. The loose, light-colored linen caliceris was the perfect garment for its environment because it was breathable, reflected solar radiation, and facilitated evaporative cooling as perspiration wicked away. Today, high-tech outdoor apparel companies have essentially reinvented the Egyptian tunic, but with synthetic fabrics. They market shirts and pants made from advanced materials that boast high UPF ratings, that's ultraviolet protection factor, to block the sun's harmful rays, essentially the high-tech equivalent of wearing light-colored linen. These modern fabrics are engineered with precise, open weaves and chemical treatments to be highly breathable and to wick moisture away from the skin rapidly, keeping the wearer dry and cool through the same evaporative process the Egyptians leveraged. Even the iconic head coverings seen in tomb paintings, which protected the neck and scalp, are mirrored in the design of modern Legionnaire-style hats or the shemagh scarves used by military personnel and desert adventurers today, which provide crucial protection from sun and sand. The ancient application of kohl around the eyes, which we now know had antibacterial properties and reduced glare, is paralleled by the use of black anti-glare strips under the eyes by modern athletes and soldiers, and the widespread recommendation by dermatologists to use mineral-based sunscreens that contain zinc oxide, a substance that acts as a physical barrier to UV light much like the kohl pigment did. When it comes to the most critical resource, water, the parallels are equally profound. The Egyptian shaduf, a simple lever and counterweight system, was a revolutionary tool for lifting water with minimal effort. While we now use electric and diesel-powered pumps, the fundamental mechanical principle of the shaduf is still taught in physics classes as a classic example of a first-class lever, and simple human-powered versions are still used in small-scale farming in many parts of the world. More significantly, the Egyptian approach to water management, capturing seasonal floodwaters in basins to recharge the aquifer and extend its availability, is a cornerstone of modern water resource management known as managed aquifer recharge. Today, we build massive engineered systems to deliberately divert floodwaters into underground reservoirs, a direct high-tech scaling up of the ancient Egyptian basin irrigation system. Their use of porous clay pots to cool water through evaporation is the same principle behind the very modern Zerpot refrigerator, a simple device consisting of one clay pot inside another with wet sand in between, which is promoted by humanitarian organizations in developing arid regions as a zero-energy way to keep food and medicine cool. It's a brilliant, low-cost technology that works precisely because of the physics the Egyptians understood instinctively. Even their practice of storing water in sealed amphorae to prevent contamination finds its parallel in today's global use of plastic water bottles and sealed hydration bladders, though the ancient version was arguably far more sustainable. Perhaps the most compelling modern parallel lies in the realm of food preservation. The Egyptians' reliance on solar drying to remove moisture and prevent spoilage is a technique that hasn't just persisted, it's been industrialized. Our modern food industry depends on massive dehydration plants that produce everything from instant soup mixes to dried fruits and jerky, all using the exact same desiccation principle, just with conveyor belts and controlled heat instead of the open sun. The use of salt as a preservative, so central to the Egyptian diet in the form of salted fish, is the foundation for curing meats like prosciutto and salt cod today. And honey, which the Egyptians revered for its eternal shelf life and used to pack fruits and tree wounds, is now the subject of intense scientific study. Medical-grade honey, particularly Manuka honey, is a certified and widely used wound dressing in modern clinics because its natural hydrogen peroxide content, low water activity, and acidic pH create a powerful antibacterial environment, just as the ancient physicians observed. This isn't just a coincidence. It's a validation of their empirical methods through the lens of modern microbiology. The legacy of Egyptian navigation and logistics is also written across our modern maps. Their celestial navigation, using the circumpolar stars to guide them across the trackless desert, is the direct ancestor of our global positioning systems. Where they use the fixed point of the North Star, we use a constellation of satellites in geostationary orbit, but the underlying goal is identical: to determine your position and plot a course through a featureless landscape. The network of fortified way stations they established in the oases along the Dar el Arbain trade route function exactly like modern highway service plazas, or the pit stops in a long-distance car rally, providing fuel in the form of food and water, rest for the pack animals, and security for the traveler. Today's long-haul trucking routes and supply chain logistics models are the digital, globalized descendants of those ancient caravan networks, ensuring that essential goods can move safely across vast, inhospitable distances. This enduring spirit of innovation, of looking at a harsh environment not as a barrier, but as a set of problems to be solved with observation, creativity, and a deep respect for natural principles, is the greatest gift the ancient Egyptians left us. Their story shows us that true technological sophistication isn't always about complexity. Sometimes, it's about the elegant application of fundamental truths, a lesson that remains as vital for our sustainable future as it was for their magnificent past. From the life-giving pulse of the Nile, harnessed by the shaduf, to the mastery of wind that propelled their ships. From the chemical genius of mummification to the spiritual framework that fortified the human spirit against chaos, the ancient Egyptians engineered a civilization perfectly in tune with its environment. Their cool tech was a comprehensive survival system, addressing every facet of existence with a blend of elegant simplicity and profound insight. They didn't just endure the desert, they decoded it, transforming its challenges into the very building blocks of their society. The passive cooling of their mud brick homes, the antibacterial protection of coal, the logistical networks of their desert oases, and the predictive power of their solar calendar were not isolated inventions. They were interconnected threads in a grand tapestry of adaptation, woven together by a culture that viewed the world as a puzzle to be solved with observation, creativity, and respect. What is perhaps most stunning is the enduring legacy of their solutions. We see their principles alive today in modern sustainable architecture, in our understanding of material science for clothing, and in our global supply chains that echo their caravan routes. They prove that true technological sophistication isn't always about complexity, but about the intelligent application of fundamental truths. By looking at their world not as a set of limitations, but as a repository of solutions, they built an empire that stood for 3,000 years, not through brute force alone, but through the quiet, relentless power of ingenuity. They teach us that survival is more than just having the right tools. It's about cultivating a mindset that sees opportunity in adversity and harmony in a harsh landscape. So, as we pull back from this journey through their incredible achievements, we're left with a sense of profound admiration. Which of these ancient innovations resonated most with you? Was it the clever simplicity of the evaporative water jar, the architectural genius that built comfort from mud and wind, or perhaps the profound spiritual beliefs that turned the fear of the desert into a quest for eternal order? Let us know in the comments below which piece of ancient Egyptian cool tech amazed you the most.